Kodiak bear kills newlyweds on hiking trail, May 30th, 2025. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kodiak Island wilderness as Joshua Michael Patterson adjusted the straps of his weathered Osprey backpack one final time. At 27, he possessed the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his weekends scaling cliff faces and traversing mountain ridges rather than sitting behind his desk at Anchorage Engineering Solutions. His calloused hands, scarred from years of rock climbing and backcountry adventures, moved with practiced efficiency as he checked the contents of their survival kit for the third time that morning. Emily Rose Patterson, née Williams, stood beside him on the wooden dock of the Afognak Island Lodge, her auburn hair catching the golden light as she gazed across the pristine waters of Raspberry Strait. At 27, she had traded her corporate law career in Seattle for this honeymoon adventure, trusting completely in her husband's wilderness expertise despite her own limited backcountry experience. The couple had arrived on Kodiak Island 3 days earlier, on May 27th, 2025, as part of an elaborate honeymoon plan that Joshua had been crafting for over a year. Their wedding on May 10th, in Emily's hometown of Bellingham, Washington, had been a modest affair attended by 150 guests, but Joshua had promised his bride an adventure that would mark the beginning of their life together with something truly extraordinary. The Afognak Island Wilderness Lodge, accessible only by float plane or boat, represented the perfect blend of comfort and remoteness that would allow them to experience Alaska's pristine wilderness while still having a safe base of operations. Lodge owner and operator Margaret Maggie Kowalski, a 62-year-old former park ranger who had moved to Alaska 30 years earlier following a bitter divorce in Minnesota, had been running wilderness excursions on Afognak Island since 1998. Her weathered face bore the lines of someone who had spent decades in the Alaskan elements, and her steel-gray eyes held the kind of wisdom that only comes from intimate knowledge of the wilderness and its dangers. She had initially expressed reservations about the Pattersons' planned 3-day solo hike to the remote northern sections of the island, particularly given Emily's limited backcountry experience. But Joshua's impressive credentials and obvious competence had eventually won her over. "You're looking at some of the most pristine wilderness in North America," Maggie explained to the couple as they stood on the lodge's wraparound deck that first evening, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided thousands of visitors through Alaska's backcountry. Afognak Island covers 1,809 square miles, and outside of the small native village of Afognak on the northwest coast, you're talking about maybe 50 permanent residents scattered across the entire island. The northern section where you're planning to hike hasn't seen more than a dozen visitors this entire season. Joshua nodded eagerly, his dark brown eyes bright with anticipation. He had been planning this adventure meticulously, studying topographical maps, weather patterns, and wildlife migration routes for months. His experience included successful solo backpacking trips through Denali National Park, the Chugach Mountains, and multiple expeditions in the Cascade Range of Washington and Oregon. Emily, while nervous about her first serious wilderness adventure, trusted her husband's judgment completely and had spent the winter months training at local gyms and taking weekend day hikes to prepare for this honeymoon expedition. The third member of their hiking party was Dr. Michael Chen, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who had been conducting brown bear research on Afognak Island for the past 6 years. Chen had been staying at the lodge for 2 weeks, wrapping up his annual assessment of the island's bear population, and had agreed to accompany the Pattersons on their first day's hike to provide additional expertise about local wildlife behavior. His presence had been instrumental in convincing Maggie to approve their solo expedition, as Chen's extensive knowledge of bear behavior and movement patterns throughout the island provided an additional layer of safety for the inexperienced couple, Dr. Chen's research had documented the presence of approximately 45 adult brown bears on Afognak Island, with the northern region of the island serving as a critical feeding area during the late spring and early summer months. The bears, subspecies of the Alaskan brown bear, closely related to the famous Kodiak bears of nearby Kodiak Island, could weigh anywhere from 400 to 800 pounds, with some exceptional males exceeding 1,000 pounds during peak feeding seasons. Chen's telemetry data had tracked several bears moving through the exact region where the Pattersons planned to hike, but recent patterns suggested most animals were concentrated in the salmon-rich streams along the island's eastern coastline, a full 15 miles from their intended route. The couple's planned itinerary called for a 3-day, 2-night backpacking loop that would take them through some of the island's most spectacular terrain. Day 1 would cover approximately 8 miles from the lodge north to their first campsite near Willow Creek, elevation 800 feet, with Dr. Chen accompanying them to provide wildlife safety briefings and help them establish proper food storage protocols. Day 2 would be their most challenging, covering 12 miles through mountainous terrain to reach their second campsite at Hidden Lake, elevation 1,400 feet, where they would spend their final night before completing the loop back to the lodge on day 3, with a relatively easy 6-mile descent through old-growth Sitka spruce forest. On the morning of May 30th, the weather conditions appeared ideal for their departure. The National Weather Service forecast called for partly cloudy skies, with temperatures ranging from 45 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn to a high of 62 degrees by mid-afternoon, with light winds from the southwest at 8 to 12 miles per hour. Visibility was excellent, with no precipitation expected for at least 48 hours. The barometric pressure had been steady at 30.15 inches of mercury for 3 consecutive days, suggesting stable weather conditions that would persist throughout their planned expedition. Joshua's gear selection reflected his years of backcountry experience and attention to detail. His primary pack contained a 4-season tent rated for wind speeds up to 60 miles per hour, 2 sleeping bags rated to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, a portable camp stove with 3 days' worth of fuel, a comprehensive first aid kit that included emergency medications, tourniquets, and signaling devices, and a satellite communicator capable of sending emergency messages to rescue services. His navigation equipment included a handheld GPS unit with backup batteries, detailed topographical maps printed on waterproof paper, and a precision compass. For bear safety, he carried a canister of bear spray with a 30-foot range, a portable electric fence system for their food storage area, and a .44 Magnum revolver with hollow point ammunition, properly licensed and registered in accordance with Alaska wilderness regulations. Emily's gear focused more on comfort and documentation of their honeymoon adventure. Her day pack contained extra layers of clothing, rain gear, personal medications including her prescription anxiety medication that she had been taking for 2 years, following a difficult period in her legal career, high-energy snacks, a professional quality camera with multiple lenses for photographing wildlife and landscapes, and personal items, including her journal where she had been documenting their honeymoon experiences. She wore lightweight hiking boots that she had broken in during 3 months of weekend training hikes, moisture-wicking clothing designed for variable weather conditions, and a wide-brimmed hat for sun protection. Dr. Chen's scientific equipment added considerable weight to their group's gear load. His pack contained radio telemetry equipment for tracking any collared bears they might encounter, sample collection materials for his ongoing research into bear diet and behavior, weather monitoring instruments, and detailed maps showing the locations of every known bear den and frequent feeding area on the northern half of the island. His personal protection consisted of industrial-strength bear spray and a 12-gauge shotgun with slugs, which he carried under special permits related to his research activities. At 7:30 a.m. on May 30th, the three hikers departed from the Afognak Island Lodge dock aboard Maggie's aluminum skiff for the short boat ride to the trailhead. The crossing of Raspberry Strait took approximately 25 minutes, with Maggie providing a running commentary about local wildlife, weather patterns, and emergency procedures. The water was unusually calm for late May, with swells of less than 2 feet and excellent visibility extending more than 10 miles in every direction. Harbour seals were visible, sunning themselves on nearby rocky outcroppings, and Maggie pointed out several stellar sea lions in the distance, their massive forms barely visible against the dark water. "Remember, you've got that satellite communicator, and I'll be monitoring the emergency frequency around the clock," Maggie reminded them as she helped unload their gear at the primitive boat landing that served as the northern trailhead. "Your check-in schedule calls for contact at 6 p.m. today from your Willow Creek campsite, then again at 6 p.m. tomorrow from Hidden Lake. If I don't hear from you by 7 p.m. either day, I'm initiating emergency procedures immediately. No exceptions, no delays." Joshua nodded seriously, understanding the critical importance of maintaining communication in such remote wilderness. "We'll stick to the schedule religiously," he assured her. "Emily's got the backup communicator in her pack, and Dr. Chen has radio telemetry equipment that can serve as an additional emergency beacon if needed." The trailhead itself consisted of nothing more than a weathered wooden post, marking the beginning of the Afognak Island Northern Loop Trail, a primitive path that had been established by subsistence hunters and fishermen decades earlier, but received minimal maintenance from any official agencies. The trail register, a metal box mounted on the post, contained entries from only 6 other parties so far in 2025, testament to the remote and challenging nature of this particular route. Joshua carefully signed their party in at 8:15 a.m., noting their planned itinerary, emergency contacts, and expected return date of June 1st. The first 2 miles of trail followed an old logging road that had been abandoned since the early 1990s, when environmental concerns led to restrictions on timber harvesting throughout the Kodiak Island archipelago. The walking was relatively easy, with gentle grades and solid footing, allowing the group to establish a comfortable pace, while Dr. Chen provided detailed information about the local ecosystem. The forest around them consisted primarily of Sitka spruce, some specimens reaching heights of over 150 feet and diameters of 4 feet or more, interspersed with western hemlock, Alaska cedar, and dense understory vegetation, including devil's club, blueberry bushes, and various ferns and mosses that created an almost jungle-like atmosphere in some sections. "This entire ecosystem is built around the salmon runs, Dr. Chen explained as they paused at a small creek crossing to filter water and adjust their packs. "Every summer, millions of salmon return to spawn in these streams, and that influx of marine nutrients supports everything from the massive trees to the smallest insects. The bears, of course, are the apex predators in this system, and their feeding behavior during salmon season determines population dynamics for dozens of other species." Emily asked numerous questions about bear behavior and safety protocols, her legal training making her naturally inclined toward thorough preparation and risk assessment. Dr. Chen patiently explained the difference between defensive attacks, where bears respond to perceived threats to themselves or their cubs, and predatory attacks, which were extremely rare but potentially more dangerous due to the animal's different motivations and behavior patterns. Brown bears on Afognak Island are generally less aggressive than their mainland counterparts, Chen explained, partly because they have abundant food sources and relatively little competition from humans. Most encounters involve bears that are simply curious about human presence or occasionally startled at close range. The key is making noise, maintaining awareness of your surroundings, and always having multiple escape routes planned when you're in dense vegetation or near streams where visibility is limited. Lull. As they progressed deeper into the wilderness, The abandoned logging road gave way to a genuine wilderness trail that required more technical hiking skills and constant attention to navigation. The path wound through increasingly dense forest, crossed multiple streams via fallen logs or rock hopping, and began to gain elevation as they approached the foothills of the island's central mountain range. The terrain became more challenging with each mile, requiring frequent consultation of their topographical maps and GPS coordinates to ensure they remained on the correct route. At approximately 11:30 a.m., after covering roughly 5 miles, the group encountered their first sign of recent bear activity. Dr. Chen immediately called a halt when he spotted fresh scat near the trail, less than 24 hours old based on its consistency and the absence of any weathering or insect activity. The scat contained visible remnants of early berries and vegetation, suggesting the bear was a medium-sized adult focused on plant-based feeding rather than actively hunting for protein sources. "This is actually good news," Chen explained as he photographed the scat for his research records. "This bear is clearly focused on foraging for vegetation and early berries, which means it's not in a protein-seeking mode that might make it more aggressive or more likely to investigate human food sources. The size and composition suggest it's probably a female, possibly with cubs, though I don't see any smaller tracks or additional scat that would confirm the presence of offspring." Joshua used this opportunity to review bear safety protocols with Emily, demonstrating the proper use of bear spray, discussing voice commands and body language that could help de-escalate a potential encounter, and reviewing their emergency action plan. Emily practiced drawing the bear spray from her belt holster, familiarizing herself with the safety mechanism and trigger operation, while Joshua checked the wind direction to ensure they understood how environmental factors might affect the spray's effectiveness. The group continued hiking with heightened awareness, making regular noise to announce their presence and carefully scanning the vegetation ahead for any signs of movement. Dr. Chen's telemetry equipment indicated that 2 of his research bears were currently located more than 8 miles to the east, well away from their planned route. But he cautioned that bears could cover substantial distances very quickly when motivated by food sources or territorial concerns. At 12:45 p.m., they reached their planned lunch stop at Sunset Ridge, a scenic overlook that provided panoramic views across the northern portion of Afognak Island and the surrounding waters of the Gulf of Alaska. The weather had remained perfect throughout the morning, with temperatures reaching a comfortable 58 degrees Fahrenheit and virtually no wind. Emily took dozens of photographs of the spectacular scenery, while Joshua consulted their maps to confirm their progress and verify their position using GPS coordinates. During lunch, Dr. Chen shared more details about his research findings and the specific bears that inhabited this region of the island. His 6 years of fieldwork had resulted in detailed profiles of individual animals, including tracking data on their seasonal movement patterns, preferred feeding areas, and behavioral characteristics. Several bears had been fitted with GPS collars that provided real-time location data, allowing Chen to monitor their movements and avoid potential conflicts with human visitors. Bear 247 is probably the individual you're most likely to encounter in this area, Chen explained, while showing them telemetry printouts and photographs of various research subjects. She's a 12-year-old female, approximately 450 pounds, with 2 cubs that are now 3 years old and becoming increasingly independent. She's generally very tolerant of human presence and tends to avoid confrontation. But like all female bears with offspring, she can become aggressive if she perceives any threat to her cubs' safety. Bear 247, whom Chen had been tracking since 2019, had established a territory that covered approximately 15 square miles of the northern Afognak Island wilderness. Her movement patterns showed a strong preference for the dense spruce forests near salmon spawning streams, with regular visits to berry patches and meadows during the early summer months. Her behavioral profile indicated a highly intelligent and adaptable animal that had successfully raised 3 litters of cubs and demonstrated remarkable problem-solving abilities when accessing difficult food sources. The interesting thing about 247 is her unusual tolerance for human scent and activity, Chen continued. Most bears in this region will avoid areas where humans have been present for several days after detecting our scent, but 247 seems curious about human presence without showing signs of fear or aggression. She's been observed following human trails at a distance, apparently investigating our scent markers and possibly learning about our behavior patterns. This information concerned Joshua somewhat, as his wilderness training had always emphasized the importance of maintaining distance from wildlife and avoiding any interactions that might habituate animals to human presence. However, Dr. Chen assured him that Bear 247's behavior fell within normal parameters for brown bears in low human density environments, and that her curiosity had never translated into aggressive behavior or attempts to access human food sources. After completing their lunch and taking time to rest and hydrate, the group resumed hiking at 1:30 p.m., with approximately 3 miles remaining to reach their planned campsite near Willow Creek. The afternoon portion of their hike would take them through some of the most challenging terrain of the day, including a steep descent through dense forest and a difficult stream crossing that required careful navigation and potentially some technical rope work, depending on water levels. The trail descended rapidly from Sunset Ridge through a series of switchbacks that had been carved into the mountainside decades earlier by local hunters and trappers. The path was often narrow and exposed, requiring careful attention to foot placement and balance, especially given the weight of their full backpacks. Emily, despite her limited backcountry experience, handled the technical terrain well, drawing on her legal career's emphasis on methodical problem-solving and attention to detail. As they descended toward Willow Creek, the forest around them became increasingly dense and the underbrush more challenging to navigate. Devil's Club, a native plant with large leaves and stems covered in sharp thorns, created natural barriers that forced hikers to stay on the established trail or risk painful injuries and torn equipment. The canopy overhead filtered sunlight into a greenish twilight that made it difficult to assess distances and identify potential hazards. At 2:15 p.m., Dr. Chen's telemetry equipment began picking up signals from one of his research bears much closer than expected. The radio collar belonging to Bear 186, a 7-year-old male weighing approximately 600 pounds, was transmitting from a location less than half a mile southeast of their current position. Chen immediately called a halt to assess the situation and determine whether they should modify their planned route. Bear 186 represented a more concerning presence than the female bear 247. Male brown bears, particularly during the late spring breeding season, could be more unpredictable and aggressive than females with cubs. Chen's research data showed that 186 had been involved in 2 aggressive encounters with other bears during the past breeding season and had demonstrated territorial behavior that included marking trees and establishing dominance over preferred feeding areas. His movement pattern suggests he's following the creek system looking for early salmon runs or possibly investigating reports of food sources, Chen explained, while monitoring the telemetry signals and consulting his detailed maps of bear territories. The good news is that his signal isn't getting stronger, which means he's not moving toward our location. The bad news is that he's positioned almost directly between us and our planned campsite. Joshua studied the topographical maps carefully, looking for alternative routes that might allow them to reach their destination while maintaining safe distance from Bear 186. The terrain options were limited due to the steep creek canyon and dense vegetation. but he identified a possible detour that would add approximately 2 miles to their hike while keeping them on higher ground, away from the bears' likely travel routes. "I think we should take the high route along the ridge system," Joshua suggested, tracing the alternative path on their waterproof map. "It adds distance and elevation gain, but it keeps us out of the creek bottom where visibility is limited and escape routes are restricted. We can still reach our planned campsite, just approaching from the northwest instead of due south." Dr. Chen agreed with this assessment, noting that the ridge route would also provide better visibility for spotting any wildlife before encountering them at close range. Emily, though tired from the challenging morning hike, expressed confidence in her ability to handle the additional distance and elevation gain. Her training over the winter months had prepared her for exactly this type of unexpected challenge. The group modified their route accordingly, leaving the established trail at 2:30 p.m. to follow a series of game trails and natural ridgelines that would keep them well away from Bear 186's suspected location. The detour required more technical navigation skills and careful attention to terrain features, but Joshua's experience with off-trail hiking in challenging conditions proved invaluable in selecting safe routes through the unmarked wilderness. As they climbed toward the ridge crest, the forest gradually opened up, providing better visibility and more opportunities to observe their surroundings for signs of wildlife activity. The physical demands of the climb were significant, with steep grades and loose footing in some sections, but the spectacular views and sense of remoteness made the extra effort worthwhile. Emily's photography skills came in handy as she documented their detour with images that would later prove valuable in reconstructing their exact route. At 3:45 p.m., they reached the ridge crest at approximately 1,200 feet elevation, providing commanding views across the northern Afognak Island wilderness. Dr. Chen's telemetry equipment now showed Bear 186 moving slowly eastward along the creek system, apparently following scent trails or investigating potential food sources. His movement pattern suggested normal foraging behavior rather than any response to human presence, which was encouraging for the group's safety. From their elevated position, they could see their planned campsite near Willow Creek, approximately 1 mile to the northwest. The area appeared ideal for wilderness camping, with level ground near the creek for water access, scattered large trees for wind protection, and good visibility in multiple directions for security purposes. No signs of recent bear activity were visible from their vantage point, and Dr. Chen's telemetry confirmed that none of his research bears were currently in that immediate area. The descent from the ridge toward their campsite required careful route finding through dense forest and over terrain that showed no signs of previous human passage. Joshua took the lead, using his compass and GPS unit to maintain their desired heading while identifying the safest path through the vegetation. Emily followed closely behind, her confidence growing with each successful navigation challenge, while Dr. Chen brought up the rear, continuously monitoring his telemetry equipment and scanning for signs of wildlife activity. At 4:30 p.m., they reached Willow Creek, approximately 200 yards upstream from their planned campsite. The creek was running at moderate levels, with clear, cold water flowing over a rocky bottom that would provide excellent drinking water after proper filtration. The surrounding forest consisted of mature Sitka spruce and western hemlock, with understory vegetation that was dense but not impenetrable. Sign of wildlife activity was minimal, with only a few old deer tracks visible in the soft soil near the water's edge. Their campsite selection followed established leave no trace principles, with their tent positioned on a slight rise that would provide drainage in case of unexpected rainfall, food storage area located at least 100 yards from their sleeping area, and downwind to minimize scent attraction to wildlife, and cooking area positioned near the creek for easy water access and waste disposal. Joshua's portable electric fence system was set up around their food storage area, creating a deterrent barrier that would discourage any curious bears from investigating their supplies. By 5:15 p.m., their camp was fully established and all safety protocols were in place. Dr. Chen conducted a final perimeter check, confirming that no recent bear sign was present in their immediate area and that his telemetry equipment showed all tracked bears at safe distances from their location. Emily prepared their evening meal using Joshua's lightweight camp stove, while Joshua tested their satellite communicator and prepared their scheduled 6 p.m. check-in message to Maggie at the lodge. The evening meal consisted of dehydrated camping food, supplemented with energy bars, dried fruit, and hot beverages. Despite the artificial nature of the food, the spectacular wilderness setting and sense of accomplishment from completing their challenging first day made everything taste exceptional. Emily documented their campsite and evening routine with photographs and detailed journal entries that captured both the physical challenges and emotional rewards of their wilderness adventure. At exactly 6 p.m., Joshua activated their satellite communicator and transmitted their scheduled check-in message to Maggie at the Afognak Island Lodge. The message confirmed their safe arrival at the Willow Creek campsite, provided GPS coordinates for their exact location, reported favorable weather conditions, and confirmed their planned departure the following morning for Hidden Lake. Maggie's response arrived within minutes, acknowledging their message and providing an updated weather forecast that continued to show stable conditions for the next 48 hours. As darkness began to fall around 9:30 p.m., the group prepared for their first night in the Alaskan wilderness. Dr. Chen conducted a final check of his telemetry equipment, confirming that Bear 186 had moved approximately 3 miles east of their location and appeared to be settling in for the night near a known salmon spawning stream. Bear 247 and her cubs were located more than 5 miles to the south, well outside their area of concern. All other tracked bears were accounted for at safe distances. Joshua established a rotating watch schedule that would ensure someone remained alert throughout the night to monitor for any signs of wildlife activity around their campsite. Although attacks on properly secured campsites were extremely rare, his wilderness training emphasized the importance of maintaining vigilance in bear country, particularly during the early summer months when bears were most active and potentially food-stressed following winter hibernation. Emily's first night in true wilderness was marked by a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that made sleep difficult despite her physical exhaustion from the day's challenging hike. The sounds of the forest around them, from the gentle gurgling of Willow Creek to the occasional crack of settling trees, created an acoustic environment completely different from her urban background. Joshua, experienced in wilderness camping, fell asleep quickly but maintained the light, alert sleep patterns that experienced outdoors people develop for safety in remote locations. Dr. Chen took the first watch from 10 p.m. to midnight, monitoring his telemetry equipment and conducting periodic perimeter checks around their campsite. His research experience had given him an intimate knowledge of bear behavior patterns during nighttime hours, and he was able to distinguish between normal forest sounds and any audio signatures that might indicate the presence of large wildlife. The night remained peaceful, with no unusual activity detected on any of his monitoring equipment. At midnight, Joshua relieved Dr. Chen for the second watch shift. The night was clear and cold, with temperatures dropping to approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit and stars visible through breaks in the forest canopy. Joshua used his watch time to review their planned route for the following day, double-check their navigation equipment, and monitor weather conditions using their portable weather radio. All indicators suggested perfect conditions for their challenging second-day hike to Hidden Lake. Emily took the final watch shift from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., her first experience with solo responsibility for wilderness security. Armed with bear spray and their satellite communicator, she found the experience both terrifying and exhilarating, representing a significant step outside her comfort zone and a test of the wilderness skills she had been developing. The forest remained quiet throughout her watch, with only the normal sounds of small nocturnal animals and the constant background murmur of Willow Creek. Dawn arrived at 5:15 a.m. on May 31st, with grey light gradually filtering through the forest canopy and revealing a world transformed by heavy morning dew. The temperature had dropped to 35 degrees Fahrenheit during the night, creating frost on their tent and making their camp stove essential for warming water and preparing hot breakfast beverages. Weather conditions appeared ideal for their planned departure, with clear skies forecast and light winds from the southwest. Joshua's morning routine included a thorough equipment check to ensure that nothing had been damaged or lost during their first night in the wilderness. Their tent had performed perfectly, keeping them dry and warm despite the cold temperatures and high humidity. All electronic equipment, including their GPS units, satellite communicator, and doctor. Chen's telemetry gear had functioned normally throughout the night. Dr. Chen's morning telemetry check revealed that Bear 186 had moved approximately 2 miles further east during the night, following the creek system toward known salmon spawning areas. Bear 247 and her cubs remained stationary about 5 miles south of their location, likely bedded down in a day resting area. No new bears had entered the region during the night, and all tracked animals appeared to be following normal behavioral patterns. Emily documented their morning preparations with photographs and journal entries that captured the challenge and beauty of wilderness camping. Her confidence had grown significantly during their first 24 hours, and she expressed enthusiasm about the day's planned hike to Hidden Lake, despite knowing it would be their most physically demanding segment. At 7:30 a.m., after completing breakfast and breaking down their campsite according to Leave No Trace principles, the 3 hikers departed Willow Creek for the second day of their wilderness adventure. The morning air was crisp and clear, with excellent visibility extending several miles through the forest openings. Bird activity was high, with numerous species taking advantage of the calm morning conditions for feeding and territorial displays. The initial portion of their route followed Willow Creek upstream for approximately 2 miles, providing relatively easy walking along established game trails and occasional sections of old human trail. The creek valley offered spectacular scenery, with cascading waterfalls, deep pools inhabited by resident trout, and occasional meadows filled with wildflowers that were beginning their late spring bloom. At 8:45 a.m., they encountered their second significant sign of bear activity since beginning their expedition. Fresh tracks in soft soil near the creek bank indicated that a large bear, possibly Bear 186 based on the size and age of the prints, had passed through the area sometime during the previous evening or early morning hours. The tracks showed normal walking gait, with no indication of agitation or unusual behavior, suggesting the bear had simply been traveling along the creek in search of food sources. Dr. Chen photographed the tracks and took measurements for his research records. The prints measured approximately 11 inches in length and 8 inches in width, indicating a large adult bear weighing between 500 and 700 pounds. The depth and clarity of the impressions suggested the tracks were less than 12 hours old, placing the bear's passage sometime after their arrival at the Willow Creek campsite the previous evening. This is probably 186 based on the size and location, Chen explained, while comparing the measurements to his existing database of track records. The timing suggests he passed through here during the night, possibly investigating the scent markers we left when we crossed the creek yesterday afternoon. The good news is that the tracks show he continued upstream away from our route, and there's no indication he deviated from his normal travel pattern. Joshua used this encounter as another opportunity to review bear safety protocols with Emily, emphasizing the importance of remaining alert and making noise to announce their presence, particularly when moving through areas with limited visibility or near water sources where the sound of running water might mask their approach. Emily practiced her bear spray deployment again, familiarizing herself with the wind conditions and optimal deployment techniques. The group continued upstream with heightened awareness, making regular noise and carefully scanning the vegetation ahead for any signs of movement. The creek valley gradually narrowed as they gained elevation, with steeper sides and denser vegetation that reduced visibility, but also provided more definitive travel routes that would be easier to navigate. At 10:15 a.m., they reached the confluence of Willow Creek and Hidden Creek, the junction where they would leave the main creek system and begin their ascent toward Hidden Lake. The confluence area represented a natural gathering point for wildlife, with abundant freshwater, diverse vegetation, and multiple travel routes converging in a relatively small area. Dr. Chen's telemetry equipment showed no bears in their immediate vicinity, but the area's characteristics made it a location requiring extra caution and awareness. The ascent toward Hidden Lake began immediately beyond the confluence, with the trail gaining approximately 800 feet of elevation over the next 4 miles. The path was steep and challenging, following a series of switchbacks through dense forest that required frequent rest stops and careful attention to navigation. Joshua's GPS showed their progress was slower than planned due to the technical difficulty of the terrain, but they remained within acceptable parameters for reaching Hidden Lake by late afternoon. Emily's physical conditioning was tested severely during the climb, with the combination of altitude gain, heavy pack weight, and technical terrain pushing her to her limits. However, her determination and the encouragement of her companions enabled her to maintain steady progress despite the challenging conditions. Joshua adjusted their pace to accommodate her needs while ensuring they would still reach their destination with adequate time to establish camp before darkness. At 11:30 a.m., they paused for water and snacks at a scenic overlook that provided their first views of Hidden Lake, still approximately 1,200 feet above their current position and nearly 3 miles distant. The lake appeared pristine and isolated, surrounded by dense forest and steep mountainsides that created a natural amphitheater effect. No signs of human presence were visible, reinforcing their sense of true wilderness isolation. Dr. Chen's telemetry check at the overlook revealed an unexpected development. Bear 247, the female with cubs, had moved significantly during the morning and was now located approximately 2 miles southeast of their position, much closer than she had been since the beginning of their expedition. Her movement pattern suggested she was traveling with purpose rather than simply foraging, possibly responding to some stimulus or seeking specific resources. "This is unusual behavior for 247, Chen observed, while studying his telemetry data and consulting detailed maps of known bear territories. She typically maintains a much smaller daily range, especially when she has cubs with her. Something has motivated her to cover a lot of ground in a short time, which could indicate food stress, territorial displacement by other bears, or response to human activity." The news created some concern among the group, as Bear 247's new position placed her much closer to their planned route and destination than any of Chen's research data had predicted. However, her behavioral profile as a generally non-aggressive bear with strong avoidance tendencies suggested that proper precautions and noise-making should be sufficient to prevent any dangerous encounters. Joshua studied their route options carefully, looking for ways to modify their approach to Hidden Lake that would minimize the likelihood of encountering Bear 247 and her cubs. The terrain provided limited alternatives due to steep slopes and dense vegetation, but he identified a possible detour that would approach the lake from the northwest rather than the southeast, potentially avoiding the area where the bear family was currently located. "We can swing wide around the ridge system and approach Hidden Lake from the opposite side," Joshua suggested while tracing the alternative route on their topographical maps. "It adds about a mile to our hike and some extra elevation gain, but it should keep us well clear of 247's current location and provide better visibility for spotting any wildlife before we encounter them." Dr. Chen agreed with this tactical modification, noting that the ridge approach would also provide better escape routes and more opportunities to make noise to announce their presence. Emily, though tired from the morning's challenging climb, expressed confidence in her ability to handle the additional distance and terrain difficulty. The group implemented their route modification at 12 p.m., leaving the established trail to follow a series of animal paths and natural terrain features that would take them around the ridge system toward the northwestern approach to Hidden Lake. The detour required more technical navigation skills and careful route finding through unmarked wilderness, but Joshua's experience and their quality navigation equipment made the adjustment manageable. As they climbed toward the ridge crest, the forest gradually opened up into alpine terrain characterized by smaller trees, more open meadows, and spectacular views across the surrounding wilderness. The change in elevation and ecosystem provided relief from the claustrophobic feeling of hiking through dense forest and allowed them to better assess their surroundings for potential hazards or points of interest. At 1:15 p.m., they reached the ridge crest at approximately 1,800 feet elevation, providing panoramic views across the northern Afognak Island wilderness and their first clear view of Hidden Lake from above. The lake appeared larger than expected, roughly oval-shaped and approximately half a mile long by quarter-mile wide, surrounded by steep forested slopes and fed by several small streams cascading down from higher elevations. Dr. Chen's telemetry equipment at this elevated position provided excellent reception for all his research bears. Bear 186 had continued moving east and was now more than 6 miles from their location, apparently settling into a productive feeding area. Bear 247 and her cubs had moved slightly closer during the past hour, now positioned approximately 1.5 miles southeast of the lake, but her movement pattern suggested she was foraging rather than traveling with any specific destination in mind. From their ridge position, they could also observe their planned campsite on the northwestern shore of Hidden Lake. The area appeared ideal for wilderness camping, with level ground near the water's edge, scattered mature trees for wind protection and bear hang options, and good visibility in multiple directions. No signs of recent bear activity were visible from their elevated vantage point. The descent toward Hidden Lake required careful navigation down steep slopes covered with loose rock and dense vegetation. Joshua took extra time to identify safe routes and established a slower pace to prevent injuries that could compromise their safety in such remote wilderness. Emily's leg muscles were becoming increasingly fatigued from the day's challenging terrain, but her mental toughness and determination carried her through the technical descent. At 2:45 p.m., they reached the shoreline of Hidden Lake and began searching for their optimal campsite location. The northwestern shore provided several excellent options, with level areas suitable for tent placement, nearby water access for cooking and cleaning, and natural windbreaks formed by large boulders and mature trees. They selected a site approximately 50 yards from the water's edge, positioned to take advantage of morning sunlight and evening views while maintaining security and leave-no-trace principles. The process of establishing their second wilderness campsite went smoothly, with each member of the group now familiar with their individual responsibilities and the overall security protocols. Joshua's portable electric fence was positioned around their food storage area, creating a deterrent barrier that would discourage any curious wildlife from investigating their supplies. Dr. Chen conducted perimeter reconnaissance to confirm no recent bear sign in their immediate area. By 4 p.m., their campsite was fully established and all safety measures were in place. Emily prepared an early dinner using their lightweight camp stove, while Joshua tested their satellite communicator and prepared their scheduled evening check-in message to Maggie at the lodge. The spectacular setting of Hidden Lake, surrounded by wilderness and complete silence except for natural sounds, created an atmosphere of profound peace and accomplishment. Dr. Chen's afternoon telemetry check showed continued normal behavior patterns from all tracked bears. Bear 247 and her cubs had moved slightly closer, now positioned approximately 1 mile southeast of the lake, but her travel speed and direction suggested continued foraging behavior rather than purposeful movement toward their location. Bear 186 remained distant to the east, apparently settled in a productive feeding area for the remainder of the day. At 5:30 p.m., Emily announced that she needed to step away from camp briefly for personal needs, a natural requirement after the day's long hike and increased fluid intake. Joshua reminded her to take bear spray and stay within voice contact of camp, while Dr. Chen continued monitoring his telemetry equipment for any changes in bear locations or behavior patterns. Emily walked approximately 100 yards southeast of their campsite, following a natural clearing that provided good visibility while offering privacy for her needs. The area she selected was positioned uphill from the lake with scattered large trees and minimal undergrowth, providing multiple escape routes and clear sightlines in several directions. She carried her bear spray in her right hand and maintained verbal contact with Joshua and Dr. Chen by calling out periodically. At 5:37 p.m., Dr. Chen's telemetry equipment suddenly began receiving much stronger signals from Bear 247's collar, indicating the animal was moving rapidly toward their general area. The signal strength was increasing quickly, suggesting the bear was covering ground at a pace much faster than normal foraging behavior would explain. Chen immediately alerted Joshua to the developing situation while trying to establish radio contact with Emily. 247's signal is getting much stronger very fast, Chen called out urgently while adjusting his telemetry equipment to get more precise directional information. She's moving toward us from the southeast, probably covering ground at 4 or 5 miles per hour, which is much faster than her normal travel speed. Something has changed her behavior pattern dramatically. Joshua immediately began calling for Emily to return to camp, his voice carrying clearly through the forest but receiving no immediate response. The combination of Bear 247's sudden movement change and Emily's temporary absence from camp created a potentially dangerous situation that required immediate action and coordination. At 5:39 p.m., Emily's voice could be heard calling back toward camp, but her tone indicated confusion or concern rather than acknowledgement of their urgent summons. Her voice seemed to be coming from a slightly different direction than expected, suggesting she might have moved further from camp than originally intended or become disoriented in the dense forest. Dr. Chen's telemetry equipment now showed Bear 247 less than half a mile from their location and still moving rapidly in their direction. The bear's movement pattern had changed from the meandering track typical of foraging behavior to the straight-line travel characteristic of an animal responding to a specific stimulus or investigating something of particular interest. Joshua grabbed his bear spray and backup canister, along with his .44 Magnum revolver, and began moving toward Emily's last known position while calling for her to respond and return to camp immediately. His wilderness training emphasized the critical importance of maintaining group unity when wildlife encounters became possible, and Emily's separation from their secure campsite created vulnerabilities for everyone. At 5:41 p.m., Emily's voice could be heard more clearly, and her words sent chills through both men. "There's a bear here. There's a bear with cubs." Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of fear and shock, though she did not sound in immediate physical danger. The confirmation that she had encountered Bear 247 and her offspring created an extremely serious situation requiring immediate and careful response. Dr. Chen continued monitoring his telemetry while Joshua moved quickly but carefully toward Emily's position, making noise to announce his approach while scanning the forest ahead for signs of the bears. The terrain between their campsite and Emily's location included dense vegetation and several large fallen trees that could conceal wildlife and complicate both visual contact and escape routes. Joshua reached a position approximately 50 yards from Emily's voice at 5:42 p.m. and was able to see her through breaks in the forest canopy. She was standing motionless near a large Sitka spruce, approximately 80 yards from a brown bear and two cubs that appeared to be investigating something on the ground. The bears had not yet noticed Emily's presence, but her position offered limited escape routes due to dense vegetation and steep terrain. "Emily, don't move," Joshua called quietly but clearly, his voice designed to reach her without startling the bears. "I can see you and the bears. They haven't noticed you yet. I want you to slowly back away toward my voice while facing them. Move very slowly and avoid any sudden movements." Bear 247, a large female weighing approximately 450 pounds with distinctive blonde-tipped fur, was focused on investigating what appeared to be a cache of food or possibly a carcass hidden beneath fallen logs and debris. Her two cubs, each roughly the size of large dogs and approximately 3 years old, were staying close to their mother while showing typical juvenile curiosity about their surroundings. Emily began backing slowly toward Joshua's position, following his whispered instructions while keeping her eyes on the bear family. Her movement was careful and controlled, drawing on the safety training they had reviewed multiple times during their preparation for this expedition. She held her bear spray ready, but pointed downward to avoid any accidental discharge that might startle the animals. At 5:44 p.m., one of the cubs noticed Emily's movement and alerted its mother with a distinctive vocalization. Bear 247 immediately stood on her hind legs to get a better view of the potential threat. Reaching a height of nearly 8 feet and presenting an imposing figure against the forest backdrop. Her behavior showed alertness and caution, but not immediate aggression, suggesting she was assessing the situation rather than preparing to attack. Joshua continued providing quiet guidance to Emily, while slowly moving to a position that would allow him to provide support if the situation deteriorated. His bear spray was ready for immediate use, and his revolver was accessible but not drawn, following protocols that emphasized de-escalation rather than confrontation whenever possible. "She's standing up to get a better look at you," Joshua whispered to Emily. "This is normal defensive behavior. Keep backing away slowly and avoid direct eye contact. If she drops down and starts moving toward you, stop and make yourself look large. Don't run unless she makes contact." Bear 247 remained standing for approximately 15 seconds, apparently trying to identify the nature of the potential threat. Her cubs stayed close to her position, but showed signs of nervousness, shifting their weight and looking between their mother and the strange humans in their territory. The tension was palpable, as everyone, human and bear alike, tried to assess the situation and determine appropriate responses. At 5:45 p.m., Bear 247 dropped back to all 4 paws and began moving slowly toward Emily's position, not in an aggressive charge, but in the cautious approach characteristic of a protective mother trying to evaluate potential threats to her offspring. Her body language showed alertness and readiness, but not the indicators of imminent attack that Joshua had learned to recognize during his wilderness safety training. "She's moving toward you, but it's not a charge," Joshua informed Emily while adjusting his own position to maintain optimal angles for intervention if necessary. Keep backing away at the same pace. Don't speed up or slow down. I'm going to start making noise to let her know there are more humans here. Joshua began calling out in a loud, firm voice. Hey, Bear! Hey, Bear! We're humans! We're leaving your area! His vocalizations were designed to identify humans as non-threatening while encouraging the bears to avoid contact rather than investigate further. The technique had proven effective in previous encounters during his wilderness experiences. Bear 247's response to Joshua's calling was immediate, but not what anyone had hoped for. Instead of being deterred by the indication of multiple humans in her territory, she seemed to become more interested and alert, possibly interpreting the situation as more complex and potentially threatening than a single person moving through her area. At 5:46 p.m., Bear 247 began moving more quickly toward Emily's position, closing the distance between them from 80 yards to approximately 60 yards. Her cubs followed closely behind, staying within a few feet of their mother, but showing increasing signs of agitation and uncertainty. The bear family's body language was shifting from cautious assessment toward more active response to what they perceived as a potential threat situation. Emily continued her careful retreat toward Joshua's position, but the dense vegetation and uneven terrain made rapid movement impossible without risking falls or becoming entangled in undergrowth. Her retreat rate was insufficient to maintain distance from Bear 247's more purposeful advance, creating a situation where confrontation was becoming increasingly likely. The distance is closing too fast, Joshua called to Emily while preparing to take more active measures. When I tell you, I want you to stop moving and make yourself look as large as possible. Raise your arms over your head and speak in a loud, calm voice. Do not run unless she makes physical contact. Dr. Chen's position back at the campsite allowed him to continue monitoring telemetry data while preparing additional emergency resources. His equipment showed that Bear 247's collar was now transmitting from a position less than 100 yards from their campsite, confirming the close proximity of the encounter. No other bears appeared to be in the immediate area, suggesting this was an isolated incident rather than part of a larger pattern of bear activity. At 5:47 p.m., Bear 247 closed the distance to approximately 40 yards from Emily's position and showed signs of becoming more agitated. Her ears were back against her head, and she was making huffing sounds characteristic of a bear experiencing stress and preparing for potential conflict. Her cubs remained close, but were showing increased nervousness and looking for direction from their mother. "Now, Emily!" Joshua called out firmly. "Stop moving and make yourself look large." Emily followed instructions precisely, stopping her retreat and raising her arms over her head while speaking in a loud, clear voice. "I'm a human. I'm not a threat to you or your cubs. I'm leaving your territory." Her voice carried well through the forest and showed remarkable composure considering the extremely dangerous situation she was facing. Bear 247's response to Emily's defensive posturing was a moment of hesitation and reassessment. She stopped her advance and stood up on her hind legs again, apparently trying to get better visual and scent information about the humans in her territory. This pause provided a crucial opportunity for de-escalation and potentially avoiding physical confrontation. Joshua used Bear 247's moment of hesitation to close the distance between himself and Emily, moving as quickly as possible through the dense undergrowth while making noise to announce his approach. His goal was to present a unified human presence that might be more intimidating to the bears while providing Emily with backup and support. At 5:48 p.m., Joshua reached Emily's position, and the two humans stood together facing Bear 247 and her cubs at a distance of approximately 35 yards. The united front appeared to give Bear 247 additional reason for caution, as she remained standing on her hind legs while apparently reassessing the situation based on the changed dynamics. "We're going to back away together," Joshua whispered to Emily. "Stay close to me and keep facing them. If she charges, we deploy bear spray simultaneously and then reassess. Remember that most charges are bluffs, but we need to be ready for real contact." The two humans began backing away together, maintaining their position facing the bears while slowly increasing distance. Bear 247 dropped back to all fours, but continued watching them intently, her body language suggesting continued alertness, but perhaps less immediate aggression than had been building during the solo encounter with Emily. Dr. Chen, monitoring the situation from camp through sound and telemetry data, had activated their satellite communicator and prepared an emergency message for transmission to rescue authorities. While the situation had not yet reached the point requiring immediate evacuation, the proximity and behavior of Bear 247 suggested that emergency services should be alerted to their location and circumstances. At 5:49 p.m., Bear 247 made a decision that changed everything. Instead of allowing the humans to withdraw peacefully from her territory, she began moving toward them again, this time at a pace that clearly indicated more aggressive intent. Her cubs followed close behind, and the entire bear family was now actively approaching the two humans with body language that suggested defensive aggression rather than simple curiosity. "She's coming again, and this time it looks more serious," Joshua informed Emily while preparing his bear spray for deployment. "Get ready to use your spray on my command. Aim slightly down from her face to account for the trajectory, and remember that we have about 4 seconds of continuous spray." The distance between the bears and humans closed rapidly as Bear 247 accelerated her approach. At 30 yards, her intent appeared clearly aggressive, with ears pinned back, huffing vocalizations, and the determined gait of an animal preparing to defend her territory and offspring against perceived threats. At 25 yards, Joshua made the decision to deploy bear spray, calling "now" to Emily as he triggered his canister. Both humans simultaneously discharged their bear sprays, creating intersecting clouds of capsaicin-based deterrent that filled the air between them and the approaching bears. The bear spray had immediate effect on Bear 247 and her cubs, causing them to stop their advance and show obvious signs of distress from the chemical irritant. Bear 247 shook her head vigorously and rubbed her face with her paws, while her cubs vocalized their discomfort and confusion. The spray had successfully halted the bear's advance and created an opportunity for the humans to increase their distance. "It's working!" Emily called out with relief as they continued backing away from the bears. "They've stopped coming toward us." However, their relief was premature. Bear spray, while often effective at deterring bears, can have variable results depending on wind conditions, individual animal sensitivity, and the specific circumstances of each encounter. In this case, while the spray initially stopped Bear 247's advance, it also seemed to increase her agitation and determination to remove the perceived threat from her territory. At 5:51 p.m., after approximately 90 seconds of pawing at her face and shaking her head to clear the chemical irritant, Bear 247 began moving toward the humans again. Her approach was now characterized by clear, aggressive intent, with vocalizations and body language indicating that she had decided to actively confront rather than simply investigate the intruders in her territory. The spray didn't fully deter her, Joshua called to Emily while preparing to deploy his backup canister. "We need to keep backing away and be ready for more aggressive action. If she gets within 15 feet, I'm drawing my firearm." The situation had evolved from a wildlife encounter that could potentially be managed through proper protocols to a genuine emergency requiring immediate and decisive action to prevent serious injury or death. Emily's fear was now clearly evident in her voice and movements, but she continued following Joshua's instructions and maintaining her position beside him. Dr. Chen, hearing the escalating situation from the campsite, made the decision to activate their emergency protocols. At 5:52 p.m., he transmitted an emergency message via their satellite communicator. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Brown bear attack in progress. Afognak Island, GPS coordinates 57.9832 degrees north, 152.7543 degrees west. 3 persons, bear spray deployed, situation critical. Request immediate rescue response. The emergency message was received by the U.S. Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center in Juneau, Alaska, which immediately began coordinating response resources, including helicopter evacuation capabilities, emergency medical services, and wildlife management personnel. The remote location and nature of the emergency meant that response time would be measured in hours rather than minutes, making the immediate actions of the people on scene critical for their survival. Bear 247's second advance was more determined and rapid than her initial approach. At 20 yards, her intent was unmistakably aggressive, with the body language and vocalizations of a bear committed to defending her territory through physical confrontation if necessary. Her cubs followed closely, adding to the complexity and danger of the situation. Joshua deployed his backup bear spray canister at 18 yards, creating another chemical barrier between the bears and humans. This second deployment was more effective due to favorable wind conditions and Bear 247's position directly downwind from the spray pattern. The bears again stopped their advance and showed significant distress from the chemical irritant. Second spray deployed successfully, Joshua called to Emily while beginning to draw his .44 Magnum revolver. If she comes through this one, I'll have to use lethal force. Be ready to move quickly in any direction I tell you. The combination of 2 bear spray deployments had created a significant chemical cloud in the forest air, affecting visibility and breathing for both humans and bears. Emily was coughing from the residual spray in the air, but maintained her position and readiness to respond to Joshua's commands. The situation remained extremely dangerous despite the temporary halt in Bear 247's advance. At 5:54 p.m., Bear 247 demonstrated the determination and problem-solving ability that had made her successful in raising multiple litters of cubs in challenging wilderness conditions. Instead of attempting to push through the chemical barrier again, she began circling around the affected area, apparently seeking an approach route that would allow her to reach the humans while avoiding the worst effects of the bear spray. "She's trying to flank us," Joshua observed, while tracking Bear 247's movement and adjusting their defensive position. "We need to keep her in front of us and maintain distance. If she gets to our side or behind us, we're in serious trouble." The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex, as Bear 247's behavior showed intelligence and adaptability that made standard bear encounter protocols less effective. Her cubs continued following her movements, creating multiple targets that would be difficult to track and respond to simultaneously if the situation deteriorated further. Emily's physical and emotional condition was showing the strain of the prolonged high-stress encounter. Her voice was becoming shaky, and her movements showed fatigue from the adrenaline response and the physical demands of the situation. However, she continued following Joshua's instructions and maintained her readiness to respond to changing circumstances. Dr. Chen continued monitoring the situation from the campsite while maintaining communication with rescue authorities via their satellite communicator. His telemetry equipment confirmed that no other bears were in the immediate area, meaning that Bear 247 and her cubs represented the only immediate wildlife threat, but also that no natural distractions were likely to draw the bears away from their confrontation with the humans. At 5:56 p.m., Bear 247 completed her flanking maneuver and began approaching the humans from a different angle, having successfully avoided the worst effects of the bear spray cloud. Her new position required Joshua and Emily to adjust their defensive stance and prepare for renewed confrontation from an unexpected direction. "She's coming from our right now," Joshua called to Emily while pivoting to face the new threat direction. "Stay with me and keep your bear spray ready. If she gets within 10 feet, I'm taking the shot." Bear 247's approach from the new angle was rapid and purposeful, covering the distance from 25 yards to 15 yards in a matter of seconds. Her body language showed complete commitment to physical confrontation, with the focused intensity of a protective mother willing to fight to defend her offspring's safety and territory. At 5:57 p.m., with Bear 247 closing rapidly to within 12 feet of their position, Joshua made the critical decision that he had hoped to avoid throughout the encounter. Drawing his .44 Magnum revolver, he aimed for center mass of the approaching bear and fired 3 rapid shots at point-blank range. The gunshots echoed through the forest with deafening intensity, temporarily disorienting everyone present and sending Bear 247's cubs fleeing in panic toward the dense undergrowth. Bear 247 herself was struck by at least 2 of the 3 shots, but remained standing and continued her approach, demonstrating the remarkable resilience and determination that makes brown bears such formidable and dangerous animals when threatened. "She's still coming!" Joshua shouted to Emily, while firing 2 additional shots at the wounded but still advancing bear. "Get behind that tree and be ready to climb if necessary." Bear 247's response to being shot was to become even more aggressive and determined, rather than being deterred or incapacitated. Despite suffering significant wounds from multiple high-caliber gunshots, she closed the final distance to physical contact with Joshua, initiating the direct physical confrontation that everyone had been desperate to avoid. The bear attack began at 5:58 p.m. when Bear 247 made physical contact with Joshua, knocking him to the ground with a powerful swipe of her front paw that tore through his jacket and left deep claw marks across his chest and shoulder. The force of the impact was tremendous, demonstrating the incredible power possessed by a 450-pound bear motivated to defend her territory and offspring. Joshua's attempts to continue firing his revolver were hampered by his prone position and the bear's proximity, but he managed to discharge 1 additional round at extremely close range before Bear 247's weight and aggression made further use of the firearm impossible. The close-range shot appeared to strike the bear in the shoulder area, but failed to stop her attack. Emily, positioned behind a large tree approximately 10 feet away, faced the horrible choice between fleeing to safety and attempting to help her husband during the attack. Her legal training and natural personality made abandoning Joshua unthinkable. But her limited experience with firearms and physical confrontation left her with few options for effective intervention. "Use your spray!" Joshua called out desperately while attempting to protect his head and neck from Bear 247's claws and teeth. "Get her off me!" Emily deployed her remaining bear spray at extremely close range, creating a chemical cloud that affected both the bear and Joshua, but succeeded in causing Bear 247 to temporarily release her grip and step back from her victim. The brief respite allowed Joshua to roll away from the bear and attempt to regain his footing, though his injuries made movement difficult and painful. Bear 247's response to the close-range bear spray was temporary retreat of approximately 6 feet, during which she shook her head and pawed at her face while remaining focused on the humans she perceived as threats to her cub's safety. Her wounds from multiple gunshots were clearly visible, but had not incapacitated her or significantly reduced her mobility and aggression. At 5:59 p.m., Bear 247 renewed her attack, this time targeting Emily as the more accessible human now that Joshua was wounded and moving slowly. The bear covered the 6-foot distance in a single bound, demonstrating the speed and agility that makes brown bears capable of outrunning humans even over short distances. Emily's attempt to evade the attacking bear was partially successful as she managed to avoid the initial contact by ducking behind the large tree she had been using for cover. However, Bear 247's persistence and intelligence allowed her to quickly adjust her approach and corner Emily against the tree trunk, limiting her escape options. "I can't get away!" Emily screamed as Bear 247 positioned herself between Emily and any possible escape route. "She's got me trapped." Joshua, despite his injuries and weakened condition, attempted to draw Bear 247's attention back to himself by shouting and throwing rocks and debris at the bear. His efforts were partially successful in creating confusion and dividing the bear's attention between multiple targets, but were insufficient to prevent Bear 247 from making physical contact with Emily. The attack on Emily began at 6 p.m. when Bear 247 struck her with a powerful paw swipe that knocked her to the ground and caused immediate serious injuries to her head and upper body. The force of the blow was sufficient to render Emily temporarily unconscious and left her unable to defend herself against continued attack. Bear 247's continued assault on Emily was interrupted by Joshua's desperate attempt to intervene physically despite his own injuries. Using a large broken tree branch as a weapon, he struck the bear repeatedly on her head and shoulders while shouting to drive her away from his wife's motionless form. The physical intervention succeeded in drawing Bear 247's attention back to Joshua, but also triggered renewed attack behavior as the wounded bear interpreted his actions as continued threat rather than defensive behavior. The bear abandoned Emily's unconscious form to renew her assault on Joshua, who was now too injured and exhausted to offer effective resistance. At 6:01 p.m., Bear 247's second attack on Joshua was more sustained and vicious than her initial assault. With Joshua unable to defend himself effectively, the bear inflicted devastating injuries, including deep claw wounds to his abdomen, severe bites to his arms and shoulders, and crushing damage from her powerful jaws and weight. Emily regained consciousness during Joshua's second mauling and witnessed the horrific scene of her husband being killed by the enraged bear. Her head injury had left her disoriented and barely able to move, but she managed to call out desperately for help while searching for any means of stopping the attack. "Please stop! Please leave him alone!" Emily's cries were barely audible due to her injuries, but represented a heartbreaking attempt to save her husband's life despite her own critical condition. Bear 247's attack on Joshua continued for approximately 2 minutes, during which time she inflicted injuries that would prove fatal regardless of medical intervention. The bear's determination to eliminate what she perceived as threats to her cub's safety overrode any other considerations, including her own significant wounds from multiple gunshot impacts. At 6:03 p.m., Bear 247 finally ceased her attack on Joshua and moved away from his motionless body. However, instead of leaving the area, she remained nearby while scanning for her cubs and assessing the overall threat situation. Her behavior indicated that she considered the humans neutralized but remained alert for any additional threats. Emily, despite her severe injuries and disorientation, managed to activate her personal locator beacon and transmit an additional emergency signal that provided updated GPS coordinates and confirmed the critical nature of their situation. Her training as an attorney had emphasized thorough documentation and communication, skills that potentially saved her life even in these desperate circumstances. The emergency signal was received by rescue authorities, who were already coordinating response efforts based on Dr. Chen's earlier transmission from the campsite. The updated information confirmed the location and severity of the incident, while providing crucial details for medical personnel preparing to respond. Dr. Chen's position at the campsite had allowed him to hear the gunshots, screaming, and sounds of the attack, but his distance from the scene and the dense forest between his position and the attack site had prevented him from providing direct assistance. His continued communication with rescue authorities provided critical coordination and intelligence gathering for the response effort. At 6:05 p.m., Bear 247 moved away from the attack site with her cubs, apparently satisfied that the perceived threats had been eliminated. However, her departure was not rapid, and she remained within the general area while her cubs, traumatized by the gunshots and confrontation, sought comfort and reassurance from their mother. Emily's survival during the following minutes depended on her ability to remain conscious and activate emergency procedures despite severe injuries and shock. Her legal career had required handling crisis situations and maintaining functionality under extreme pressure, skills that proved invaluable in managing her own medical emergency. The first rescue helicopter, a U.S. Coast Guard MH-60 Jayhawk from Air Station Kodiak, was launched at 6:15 p.m. with a crew including emergency medical technicians and equipment necessary for wilderness rescue operations. The helicopter's response time to the remote location was estimated at approximately 45 minutes, creating a critical window during which Emily would need to survive on her own. Emily's condition deteriorated rapidly due to blood loss from head trauma and possible internal injuries from Bear 247's attack. Her ability to remain conscious and coherent became increasingly difficult, but she continued attempting to communicate with rescue authorities via her emergency beacon and provide updates on her status. Dr. Chen made the difficult decision to abandon the safety of the campsite and attempt to reach Emily's location to provide medical assistance. His movement toward the attack site required extreme caution due to Bear 247's continued presence in the area and the possibility that she might interpret additional human activity as renewed threat to her cubs. At 6:20 p.m., Dr. Chen reached the attack site and found Emily conscious but severely injured, with Joshua's body nearby showing the devastating results of Bear 247's sustained attack. The scene was horrific, with blood evidence and signs of struggle scattered across a wide area of disturbed forest floor. Emily's injuries included severe head trauma with possible skull fracture, multiple deep lacerations on her arms and torso, and signs of internal injuries that required immediate medical attention. Her survival depended on receiving professional emergency medical care within a very limited time window. Dr. Chen's wilderness first aid training allowed him to provide basic medical stabilization, including pressure bandages to control bleeding and positioning to maintain Emily's airway and circulation. However, the severity of her injuries exceeded his ability to provide definitive care, making rapid evacuation her only realistic chance of survival. "Emily, can you hear me?" Dr. Chen asked while assessing her condition and preparing bandaging materials. "Help is coming. A helicopter is on the way. I need you to stay awake and keep talking to me." Emily's responses were increasingly weak and disoriented, but she remained conscious enough to provide basic information about her condition and the attack details. Her account of the encounter would later prove valuable for understanding Bear 247's behavior and preventing similar incidents. Bear 247's location during Dr. Chen's medical treatment of Emily remained unknown, but presumably close as her cubs' distress calls could be heard periodically from the dense forest surrounding the attack site. The ongoing presence of the bear family created additional danger for both Emily and Dr. Chen. At 6:35 p.m., the rescue helicopter arrived overhead and began assessing the landing zone and overall tactical situation. The pilot's initial observations revealed the attack site, confirmed the presence of casualties, and identified the need for immediate medical evacuation while maintaining awareness of continued bear threats. The helicopter crew's approach to the rescue operation required balancing speed for Emily's medical needs against safety considerations due to Bear 247's unknown location and potential for renewed aggression if startled by the aircraft's noise and presence. The crew included a flight medic trained in wilderness trauma care and equipped with advanced life support capabilities. Emily's evacuation from the attack site began at 6:42 p.m. when the helicopter crew established a secure perimeter and began providing emergency medical care. Her condition had deteriorated significantly during the time since the attack, and her survival probability was assessed as critical but possible with immediate hospital treatment. The helicopter's medical crew worked rapidly to stabilize Emily's condition while preparing for emergency transport to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage, the nearest facility equipped for major trauma care. Their assessment confirmed severe head trauma, significant blood loss, and multiple injuries requiring surgical intervention. Joshua's body was recovered simultaneously with Emily's evacuation, though obviously no medical intervention was possible given the extent of his injuries from Bear 247's sustained attack. The recovery operation required careful documentation for both legal and wildlife management purposes. Dr. Chen was also evacuated from the site, both for his safety given Bear 247's continued presence and for his value as a witness to provide detailed information about the incident to investigators and wildlife management authorities. At 7:15 p.m., the rescue helicopter departed from the attack site with all 3 humans aboard, leaving behind a scene that would require extensive investigation by multiple agencies. The flight to Anchorage would take approximately 90 minutes, during which time Emily's medical condition remained critical but stable. Bear 247 and her cubs were observed from the air during the helicopter's departure, positioned approximately 200 yards from the attack site in dense forest. The bears appeared calm and showed no signs of the injuries that 247 had sustained from multiple gunshot wounds, though closer assessment would require ground-based investigation. The initial news reports of the incident began appearing within hours of the rescue, though details were limited pending official investigation and notification of family members. The remote location and dramatic circumstances generated immediate media interest that would continue for weeks. Emily Patterson was admitted to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in critical condition at 8:45 p.m. on May 31, 2025. Her injuries included severe head trauma with skull fracture, multiple deep lacerations requiring extensive suturing, and internal injuries that required emergency surgery to prevent life-threatening complications. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the trauma surgeon who treated Emily, later described her injuries as among the most severe bear attack cases she had encountered during 15 years of emergency medicine in Alaska. Emily's survival was attributed to her physical fitness, rapid emergency response, and the excellent stabilization care provided by Dr. Chen at the remote attack site. Joshua Patterson's body was transported to the Alaska State Medical Examiner's office in Anchorage for autopsy and official determination of cause of death. The preliminary examination confirmed that he had sustained fatal injuries consistent with brown bear attack, including massive trauma to his chest, abdomen, and extremities. The official investigation of the incident began immediately upon notification of rescue authorities and involved multiple agencies, including the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Alaska State Troopers, and the National Transportation Safety Board due to the helicopter rescue operation. Wildlife biologist Dr. Michael Chen's eyewitness account provided crucial information for investigators trying to understand the circumstances that led to Bear 247's aggressive behavior and the failure of standard bear deterrent methods to prevent the attack. His detailed knowledge of 247's behavioral history became central to the investigation. Maggie Kowalski, owner of the Afognak Island Lodge, was interviewed extensively about her decision to approve the Patterson's wilderness expedition and the safety briefings and equipment provided to the couple. Her 30 years of wilderness guiding experience and excellent safety record became relevant factors in assessing liability and prevention measures. The recovery of Bear 247's radio collar and analysis of her telemetry data provided investigators with detailed information about her movements before, during, and after the attack. The data revealed that she had been traveling much more extensively than usual in the days leading up to the incident, possibly indicating stress or displacement from her normal territory. Initial media coverage of the incident focused on the dramatic rescue and Emily's survival, but quickly expanded to broader questions about wilderness safety, bear management policies, and the risks associated with adventure tourism in Alaska's remote areas. The newlywed status of the victims added human interest that kept the story in national headlines for several weeks. Emily Patterson's medical recovery required multiple surgeries and months of intensive rehabilitation therapy. Her head injuries resulted in permanent partial hearing loss and some cognitive impacts that affected her ability to practice law at her previous level. However, her survival was considered remarkable given the severity of her injuries. The psychological trauma of witnessing her husband's death and surviving the bear attack herself required extensive therapy and support. Emily developed post-traumatic stress disorder that included anxiety attacks, nightmares, and inability to spend time in wilderness settings that had previously been enjoyable for her. Dr. Chen's research on Afognak Island brown bears was suspended indefinitely following the incident, as wildlife management authorities reviewed safety protocols for research activities and reassessed the behavioral profiles of individual bears based on new data from the attack. Bear 247 was located and euthanized by wildlife management officials 3 days after the attack, along with her 2 cubs. The decision to destroy the bears was controversial, but considered necessary due to 247's demonstrated willingness to attack humans and the possibility that her cubs had learned aggressive behavior patterns. The next stories: Polar bear attacks oil rig crew, 2 dead in 9 minutes, December 3rd, 2024. The Arctic wind screamed across the Beaufort Sea at 37 knots, carrying with it the metallic taste of approaching winter and the acrid smell of crude oil that had become as familiar to the crew of North Star Platform Alpha as their own breath. Thomas Michael Evans adjusted his hard hat against the relentless gusts, his weathered hands gripping the safety rail as he surveyed the endless expanse of ice-covered water stretching toward the horizon. At 52, Thomas had spent more than half his life on oil rigs scattered across the most unforgiving corners of Alaska, from the Cook Inlet to the North Slope, but nothing had prepared him for the isolation and brutal conditions of this particular platform, suspended like a metal island 30 miles northeast of Prudhoe Bay. The platform stood on massive concrete legs, anchored to the seafloor 60 feet below, its superstructure rising another 120 feet above the churning waters. Every surface was coated in a thin layer of ice that formed and reformed with each passing hour, creating treacherous walking conditions that had already sent 3 workers to the infirmary with broken bones and severe lacerations. The drilling tower dominated the center of the platform, its steel framework groaning under the constant assault of Arctic winds that regularly exceeded 50 miles per hour. Attached to the main structure were the living quarters, mess hall, communications center, and the helicopter landing pad that served as their only connection to the outside world when weather permitted flights. Thomas pulled his parka tighter around his massive frame, the synthetic insulation crackling in the cold. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 230 pounds, most of it muscle built from decades of manual labor in conditions that would break lesser men. His face bore the deep lines and permanent squint of someone who had spent countless hours exposed to sun, wind and snow, while his hands were covered in scars from burns, cuts and frostbite that told the story of a career spent wrestling with industrial machinery in the world's most hostile environments. Born in Fairbanks to a family that had arrived during the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, Thomas had known from childhood that his future lay in extracting black gold from the frozen earth. His colleague, Robert James Green, emerged from the equipment shed, carrying a clipboard thick with maintenance reports and inspection checklists. At 47, Robert was shorter than Thomas by several inches, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his position through competence rather than physical intimidation. His sandy hair was already showing streaks of grey despite his relatively young age, a testament to the stress of managing safety protocols on one of the most dangerous industrial installations in North America. Robert had started his career as a roughneck on land-based rigs in Texas before gradually working his way north, drawn by the higher pay and the challenge of Arctic operations. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of safety regulations and emergency procedures that had saved lives on multiple occasions, making him invaluable to any crew willing to trust his judgment. The 2 men had worked together for 3 years across various platforms operated by Boreas Energy Corporation, developing the kind of wordless communication that exists between experienced workers who depend on each other for survival. Thomas handled the heavy mechanical work, while Robert managed the complex safety systems and protocols that kept the platform operational in conditions that regularly dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Their partnership had been tested through equipment failures, medical emergencies, and weather events that had forced evacuation of less experienced crews, but they had never encountered anything like what would unfold on December 3rd, 2024. The platform's current crew consisted of 18 men and 2 women, each selected for their expertise and ability to function under extreme isolation and stress. Platform manager Daniel Rodriguez had been running offshore operations for Boreas Energy for 12 years, earning a reputation for maintaining safety standards even when corporate pressure demanded faster production schedules. At 41, Daniel carried the weight of responsibility for every person on the platform, a burden that showed in his prematurely grey hair and the deep worry lines that had developed around his eyes. He had grown up in Houston's 5th Ward, the son of immigrants who had worked in petrochemical plants along the ship channel, and he understood both the opportunities and dangers that came with oil field work. Chief Safety Officer Margaret Chen had joined the platform crew 6 months earlier, replacing a veteran inspector who had suffered a heart attack during a particularly brutal winter storm. At 34, Margaret brought 15 years of experience in industrial safety to her role, including certifications in confined space rescue, hazardous materials handling, and emergency medical response. She had earned her engineering degree from the University of Alaska Anchorage while working nights at a fish processing plant to pay for her education, developing an appreciation for the kind of working-class determination that characterized most of the platform's crew. Margaret had fought against skepticism from older workers who questioned whether a woman could handle the physical and psychological demands of offshore work, proving herself through meticulous attention to detail and an unwavering commitment to protecting her colleagues. The platform's head mechanic was James Patterson, a 38-year-old veteran of Navy submarine service who had transitioned to oilfield work after completing his military service. James possessed an intuitive understanding of complex mechanical systems that made him indispensable when equipment failures threatened to shut down operations. His compact frame belied the strength required to handle heavy machinery in cramped spaces, while his methodical approach to troubleshooting had prevented numerous catastrophic failures. James had grown up in rural Maine, developing outdoor skills that served him well in the Arctic environment, including an extensive knowledge of wildlife behavior that would prove crucial in the events to come. The drilling crew was led by Carl Morrison, a 43-year-old supervisor whose 20-year career had taken him from the oil sands of Alberta to the offshore platforms of the North Sea before he arrived in Alaska. Carl's experience with deep-water drilling made him valuable for the complex extraction operations that characterized North Star Platform Alpha, where engineers were attempting to tap reserves located more than 2 miles beneath the seafloor. His crew included younger workers, like Michael Santos, a 26-year-old from Phoenix who had come north seeking high-paying work to support his wife and 2 young children, and David Kim, a 28-year-old petroleum engineering graduate who was gaining practical experience before pursuing management positions. The platform's cook was Maria Gonzalez, a 51-year-old former restaurant owner from Anchorage who had lost her business during the economic downturn that followed the 2020 pandemic. Maria's ability to prepare satisfying meals using limited ingredients and equipment had made her popular among the crew, while her motherly concern for the younger workers provided emotional support that was crucial for maintaining morale during long periods of isolation. She worked closely with supply coordinator Alan Foster, a 39-year-old logistics specialist who managed the complex process of ensuring the platform had adequate food, equipment, and materials, despite being completely dependent on helicopter deliveries that were frequently cancelled due to weather. The communications and electronic systems were maintained by Kevin Walsh, a 32-year-old former Air Force technician whose expertise with satellite communications, radar systems, and computer networks kept the platform connected to the outside world. Kevin's workstation in the communications center resembled a NASA mission control room, with multiple monitors displaying weather data, ship traffic, equipment status, and communication channels that linked the platform to emergency services, corporate headquarters, and other installations throughout the Arctic. His backup was Jennifer Liu, a 24-year-old electrical engineer who had graduated from MIT before deciding to pursue hands-on experience in industrial settings rather than a traditional corporate career path. The security and emergency response functions were handled by former police officer William Thompson, a 45-year-old who had spent 15 years with the Anchorage Police Department before seeking higher pay in private security work. William's law enforcement background included specialized training in crisis response, weapons handling, and emergency medical care that made him responsible for coordinating responses to serious incidents on the platform. He worked closely with emergency medical technician Sarah Johnson, a 36-year-old paramedic who had previously worked for rural ambulance services in interior Alaska, gaining experience with wilderness medicine and evacuation procedures under extreme conditions. The platform's environmental compliance officer was Dr. Rachel Martinez, a 39-year-old marine biologist who monitored the impact of drilling operations on Arctic ecosystems while ensuring compliance with federal environmental regulations. Rachel's academic background included extensive research on Arctic wildlife populations, particularly marine mammals and polar bears, making her uniquely qualified to assess environmental risks associated with offshore drilling. Her presence on the platform reflected Boreas Energy's commitment to environmental stewardship, though she often found herself in conflict with production-focused management when environmental concerns threatened to slow operations. Rounding out the crew were roughnecks Luis Rivera and Mark Anderson, both experienced oil field workers in their early 30s who handled the dangerous task of managing drilling equipment under extreme conditions. Luis had immigrated from Venezuela as a teenager, working his way through various manual labor jobs before finding steady employment in Alaska's oil industry. Mark was a third-generation Alaskan whose grandfather had worked on the original Trans-Alaska Pipeline construction, giving him deep roots in the state's petroleum industry. Both men possessed the combination of physical strength, technical skill, and mental toughness required to perform their duties safely in one of the world's most dangerous work environments. The platform operated on a schedule that divided the crew into two 12-hour shifts, ensuring continuous operation of critical systems while providing adequate rest periods for workers operating under extreme stress. The day shift typically ran from 6 in the morning until 6 at night, while the night shift covered the remaining 12 hours. This schedule had been in place since the platform became operational 6 months earlier, though the approaching Arctic winter was forcing modifications as daylight hours dwindled toward the complete darkness that would characterize the next 3 months. December 3rd, 2024 began like most days on North Star Platform Alpha, with the day shift crew gathering in the mess hall at 5:30 in the morning for coffee and a briefing on the day's planned activities. The platform's location in the Beaufort Sea placed it in one of the most remote and dangerous marine environments on Earth, where temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds could exceed hurricane force with little warning. The crew had learned to function as a tightly coordinated unit, understanding that survival depended on their ability to support each other through equipment failures, medical emergencies, and weather events that could isolate the platform for days or weeks at a time. Thomas Evans arrived early for the morning briefing, as was his habit, using the extra time to review maintenance schedules and inspect equipment that would be critical for the day's operations. He had been working the day shift since arriving on the platform 3 weeks earlier, replacing a mechanic who had been evacuated due to appendicitis. The transition to platform life had been easier for Thomas than for many workers, since his extensive experience with offshore drilling had prepared him for the isolation and harsh conditions. However, he had noticed increasing signs of stress among some crew members as the Arctic winter intensified, manifesting in shorter tempers, difficulty sleeping, and the kind of cabin fever that could lead to serious conflicts in confined spaces. Robert Green joined Thomas at their usual table near the mess hall's large windows, which offered a view of the ice-covered sea stretching toward the horizon. The windows were fitted with multiple panes of reinforced glass designed to withstand the impact of wind-blown ice and debris, but they still allowed the crew to maintain visual contact with the outside world. This connection was psychologically important for workers who might otherwise feel completely cut off from civilization, though the view also served as a constant reminder of their vulnerability in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The morning briefing was conducted by platform manager Daniel Rodriguez, who used the session to review safety procedures, discuss weather forecasts, and coordinate the complex logistics of offshore drilling operations. Daniel's leadership style emphasized clear communication and shared responsibility, understanding that effective teamwork was essential for survival in their isolated environment. The briefing covered topics ranging from equipment maintenance schedules to emergency evacuation procedures, ensuring that every crew member understood their role in maintaining platform safety and operational efficiency. Weather reports for December 3rd indicated deteriorating conditions, with temperatures expected to drop to -35 degrees Fahrenheit and winds increasing to 45 knots by evening. These conditions were within normal operating parameters for the platform, though they would require additional precautions for workers performing duties outside the heated sections of the facility. The forecast also included the possibility of snow squalls that could reduce visibility to near zero, a condition that would ground helicopter operations and leave the platform completely isolated until weather improved. Chief Safety Officer Margaret Chen used the briefing to review recent updates to emergency procedures, including new protocols for wildlife encounters that had been developed following reports of increased polar bear activity in the region. These protocols emphasized the importance of maintaining situational awareness when working outside, using proper communication procedures when wildlife was spotted, and following established evacuation routes to secure areas of the platform. Margaret's presentation included photographs and video footage of polar bears that had been observed near other installations in the region, helping crew members understand the size and potential danger posed by these apex predators. The briefing concluded with work assignments for the day shift, which included routine maintenance on drilling equipment, inspection of safety systems, and preparation for a supply helicopter that was scheduled to arrive in the afternoon if weather conditions permitted. Thomas Evans was assigned to work with Robert Green on servicing the platform's emergency generator systems, a critical task that would require them to work outside in the machinery area located on the platform's lower deck. This assignment placed them in one of the most exposed areas of the platform, where they would be vulnerable to both harsh weather conditions and potential wildlife encounters. Following the briefing, the crew dispersed to their various duties, with most workers remaining inside the heated sections of the platform, while a few brave souls ventured outside to perform essential maintenance tasks. The platform's design included multiple layers of safety systems and redundant equipment, but the harsh Arctic environment required constant attention to prevent failures that could threaten the lives of everyone on board. This ongoing maintenance work was performed by skilled technicians like Thomas and Robert, whose expertise and dedication kept the platform operational under conditions that would quickly destroy less robust facilities. The morning hours passed without incident as the crew settled into their familiar routines, though several workers reported seeing what appeared to be ice formations moving in the distance. These sightings were not unusual, since wind and current could cause ice flows to shift position rapidly, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. However, the reports were noted by the communications center and included in the platform's daily log, which documented all unusual observations for later review by safety personnel and wildlife authorities. Thomas and Robert began their work on the emergency generators shortly after 8 in the morning, bundling up in multiple layers of protective clothing before venturing outside into the bitter Arctic wind. The generators were housed in a weatherproof enclosure on the platform's lower deck, surrounded by safety railings and emergency equipment that included fire suppression systems, first aid supplies, and communication devices linked to the platform's central control room. The work required them to perform detailed inspections of electrical connections, fuel systems, and mechanical components while wearing heavy gloves that made fine motor control difficult. The emergency generators served as backup power sources for critical platform systems, ensuring that navigation lights, communication equipment, and safety systems would continue operating even if the main power plant failed. Regular maintenance was essential to ensure these generators would start quickly and run reliably when needed, since power failures in Arctic conditions could quickly become life-threatening emergencies. Thomas and Robert had performed similar maintenance on dozens of other platforms, developing efficient procedures that minimize their exposure to harsh weather while ensuring thorough inspection of all critical components. As the morning progressed, other crew members reported additional sightings of movement on the ice surrounding the platform, with some observers noting that the formations appeared to be approaching the installation rather than drifting randomly with wind and current. These reports were relayed to platform manager Daniel Rodriguez, who consulted with Environmental Compliance Officer Dr. Rachel Martinez about the possibility that wildlife might be attracted to the platform. Rachel's expertise in Arctic ecology included extensive knowledge of polar bear behavior, making her the most qualified person on the platform to assess potential wildlife threats. Dr. Martinez explained that polar bears were naturally curious animals that might be attracted to the platform by smells, sounds, or visual cues that differed from their normal environment. The installation's lights, machinery noise, and waste disposal systems could all serve as attractants for bears searching for food sources in the increasingly harsh conditions of early winter. She recommended increased vigilance for wildlife encounters, particularly for crew members working outside the protected areas of the platform, and suggested implementing enhanced communication procedures to ensure rapid response if bears were confirmed in the vicinity. The platform's location in the Beaufort Sea placed it within the historical range of the southern Beaufort Sea polar bear subpopulation, which consisted of approximately 1,500 animals that ranged across northern Alaska and northwestern Canada. These bears were among the largest and most powerful predators in the Arctic, with adult males reaching weights of up to 1,600 pounds and possessing the strength to easily overpower any human. The bears were also highly intelligent and adaptable, capable of learning to associate human installations with potential food sources, making them persistent and dangerous when they decided to investigate offshore platforms. Polar bears were uniquely adapted for life in the Arctic marine environment, with dense fur that provided insulation in temperatures below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, massive paws that functioned as both snowshoes and swimming paddles, and an acute sense of smell that could detect seals breathing through ice holes from more than a mile away. These adaptations made them supremely effective hunters in their natural environment, but they also made them formidable opponents when they came into conflict with humans. Adult polar bears could run at speeds exceeding 25 miles per hour, swim for hours in near-freezing water, and use their powerful claws and teeth to break through barriers that would stop other animals. The bear's natural behavior included extensive travel across sea ice in search of seals, their primary food source, but climate change was forcing them to adapt to new hunting strategies as traditional ice formations became less reliable. This adaptation sometimes brought them into contact with human installations, where they might investigate new sights, sounds, and smells that could potentially lead to food sources. Oil platforms, with their constant activity, bright lights, and waste disposal systems, could be particularly attractive to hungry bears, especially during periods when natural food sources were scarce. By 10:30 in the morning, the sightings of movement on the ice had become more frequent and consistent, with multiple crew members reporting what appeared to be a large, yellowish-white shape moving steadily toward the platform. Communications officer Kevin Walsh used the platform's surveillance cameras to scan the surrounding ice, though the harsh lighting conditions and blowing snow made it difficult to distinguish between actual wildlife and ice formations shaped by wind and current. The cameras were equipped with zoom lenses and low-light capabilities, but their effectiveness was limited by weather conditions that created constant interference and false images. Platform manager Daniel Rodriguez decided to implement precautionary measures based on the accumulating reports of possible wildlife activity, ordering all non-essential outdoor work to be suspended until the situation could be resolved. This decision affected several maintenance projects, including the generator work being performed by Thomas Evans and Robert Green, though they were allowed to continue since the emergency generators were considered critical systems that could not be left in a partially serviced condition. Rodriguez also ordered enhanced communication procedures, requiring all workers to maintain radio contact when working outside and to report any wildlife sightings immediately. The precautionary measures reflected standard protocols that had been developed through years of experience operating in polar bear habitat, though actual encounters with bears on offshore platforms were relatively rare due to the distance from shore and the difficulty bears faced in reaching installations surrounded by open water. However, the approach of winter was creating unusual ice conditions that might allow bears to travel farther from shore than normal, potentially bringing them into contact with offshore installations for the first time in years. Thomas and Robert continued their generator maintenance work, though they increased their vigilance and checked in more frequently with the communications center. Their work location on the lower deck provided good visibility of the surrounding ice, making them valuable observers for monitoring wildlife activity in the area. The generator enclosure also offered some protection from wind and weather, though it would provide little shelter if dangerous wildlife actually reached the platform. At 11:15 in the morning, James Patterson, the platform's head mechanic, reported a definitive sighting of what appeared to be a polar bear approximately 200 yards from the platform's southeastern corner. The bear was moving steadily across the ice in the direction of the installation, pausing occasionally to investigate scents or sounds that caught its attention. Patterson's report was confirmed by several other crew members who observed the animal through binoculars, noting its massive size and purposeful movement toward the platform. The confirmed sighting triggered immediate implementation of the platform's wildlife encounter protocols, which had been developed in consultation with wildlife authorities and based on experiences at other Arctic installations. Platform manager Daniel Rodriguez ordered all outdoor work to cease immediately, with workers instructed to return to the interior of the platform and secure all exterior doors and hatches. The protocols also required activation of the platform's emergency communication systems, notifying Coast Guard authorities and wildlife management agencies of the potential threat. Dr. Rachel Martinez assumed responsibility for monitoring the bear's behavior and providing expertise on polar bear biology that could inform the crew's response. She observed the animal through powerful binoculars from the platform's communications center, noting behavioral cues that might indicate the bear's intentions and level of aggressiveness. Her initial assessment suggested that the bear was investigating the platform out of curiosity rather than exhibiting predatory behavior, though she cautioned that polar bear behavior could change rapidly if the animal became stressed or identified potential food sources. The bear was estimated to be an adult male, weighing approximately 1,200 pounds, based on its size relative to recognizable objects on the ice and its distinctive body proportions. Adult male polar bears were known to be more aggressive and less predictable than females, particularly during the fall season when they were building fat reserves for the approaching winter. This individual appeared to be in good physical condition, suggesting that it was a successful hunter that might be less motivated by desperation than bears that were struggling to find adequate food sources. Thomas Evans and Robert Green received the order to cease outdoor work and return to the platform's interior, but their location in the generator enclosure placed them in a position where retreat might actually increase their exposure to danger. The route from the generator area to the nearest secure entrance required them to cross an open section of deck that would leave them completely exposed if the bear managed to climb onto the platform. After consulting with platform manager Rodriguez and safety officer Chen, they decided to remain in the generator enclosure while monitoring the bear's approach and maintaining radio communication with the control room. The generator enclosure was constructed of heavy steel and featured a secure door that could be locked from the inside, providing reasonable protection against wildlife intrusion. The enclosure also contained emergency supplies, including food, water, medical kit, and communication equipment that could sustain them for several hours if necessary. However, the enclosure's design was primarily intended to protect equipment from weather rather than to serve as a wildlife shelter, and its effectiveness against a determined polar bear was questionable. As the bear continued its approach toward the platform, crew members inside the installation began implementing additional safety measures, including securing all food storage areas, activating exterior lighting systems, and preparing emergency evacuation procedures in case the situation escalated. The platform's design included multiple levels and compartments that could serve as refuge areas, though the crew had never been forced to test these measures against an actual polar bear encounter. At 11:45 in the morning, the polar bear reached the edge of the ice where it met the platform's concrete support legs, pausing to investigate the massive structures that anchored the installation to the seafloor. The bear's behavior suggested intense curiosity as it sniffed around the base of the platform, occasionally standing on its hind legs to reach higher surfaces and using its powerful claws to scratch at the concrete. This investigation phase was critical, since it would determine whether the bear would lose interest and move away, or become more determined to access the platform itself. Dr. Martinez observed the bear's behavior carefully, noting that it was displaying typical investigatory patterns rather than aggressive posturing. However, she warned that polar bears were excellent climbers when motivated, capable of scaling vertical surfaces that would challenge human climbers. The platform's design included emergency measures to prevent wildlife access, including smooth-sided barriers and deterrent systems. But these measures had never been tested against a large and determined polar bear. The bear's investigation of the platform's base continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which time it methodically explored each of the 4 concrete support legs and appeared to be testing different approaches for climbing onto the platform. The animal's behavior suggested high intelligence and problem-solving ability, characteristics that made polar bears particularly dangerous when they decided to overcome obstacles. Platform personnel watched nervously as the bear experimented with different climbing techniques, occasionally managing to get several feet up the smooth concrete before sliding back to the ice. Communications Officer Kevin Walsh maintained continuous contact with Coast Guard authorities and wildlife management agencies, providing updates on the bear's location and behavior while requesting guidance on appropriate response measures. The Coast Guard indicated that helicopter rescue operations would be extremely difficult due to deteriorating weather conditions, but they were placing crews on standby in case emergency evacuation became necessary. Wildlife authorities recommended passive deterrence measures, including noisemakers and flares, but cautioned against any actions that might provoke aggressive behavior from the bear. At 12:20 in the afternoon, the polar bear successfully found a climbing route that allowed it to reach the platform's lower deck, using a combination of its powerful claws and tremendous upper body strength to pull itself up the concrete support leg. The bear's arrival on the platform triggered immediate activation of all emergency protocols, with crew members retreating to secure areas, while platform manager Rodriguez attempted to coordinate a response that would drive the animal away without endangering personnel. The bear's presence on the platform created an unprecedented crisis that tested the crew's training and emergency procedures under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The animal stood more than 4 feet tall at the shoulder when walking on all fours, and nearly 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs to investigate objects that caught its attention. Its massive head featured small, dark eyes that missed nothing as it systematically explored this new environment, while its powerful jaws contained teeth designed to crush the bones of seals and other prey animals. Thomas Evans and Robert Green found themselves in an extremely dangerous position, trapped in the generator enclosure, while the polar bear explored the lower deck area just 50 yards from their location. They maintained radio silence to avoid attracting the bear's attention, communicating with the control room through hand signals and written messages that could be transmitted through their radio's text messaging system. Their position gave them an unobstructed view of the bear's movements while providing some protection. Though both men understood that their shelter would provide little safety if the bear decided to investigate the generator enclosure, the bear spent nearly an hour exploring the platform's lower deck, investigating equipment, storage containers, and structural elements with the methodical thoroughness of a skilled detective. Its behavior suggested that it was evaluating the platform as a potential territory or food source, marking certain areas with scent and returning repeatedly to locations that seemed particularly interesting. The animal showed no signs of fear or agitation, moving with the confident ease of an apex predator that had never encountered a threat it couldn't handle. Platform personnel attempted several passive deterrence measures, including activating loud machinery, turning on additional lighting, and using the platform's public address system to broadcast human voices and industrial noises. However, the bear appeared largely unaffected by these measures, occasionally looking in the direction of sounds, but showing no inclination to leave the platform. Dr. Martinez explained that polar bears living in Arctic environments were accustomed to various mechanical noises from ships, aircraft, and industrial installations, making them less likely to be deterred by sound alone. As the afternoon progressed, the bear's exploration became more focused and intensive, with the animal paying particular attention to areas where food smells might be concentrated. The platform's waste management systems, equipment maintenance areas, and ventilation intakes all received careful investigation as the bear used its extraordinary sense of smell to map the installation's activity patterns. This behavior suggested that the bear was considering the platform as a long-term presence in its territory rather than simply passing through during its travels. The crew's situation became increasingly desperate as weather conditions continued to deteriorate, with wind speeds increasing to over 40 knots and temperature dropping toward -35 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions made helicopter evacuation impossible, while also creating additional stress for crew members who were already dealing with the unprecedented threat of a large predator on their facility. Platform manager Rodriguez faced difficult decisions about whether to attempt more aggressive deterrence measures that might drive the bear away but could also provoke dangerous behavior. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the polar bear's investigation brought it to within 20 yards of the generator enclosure where Thomas Evans and Robert Green remained hidden. The bear had been systematically working its way around the platform's perimeter, and the generator area represented the next logical area for exploration. Both men understood that discovery was now inevitable, forcing them to consider their options for dealing with a close encounter with one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators. Safety protocols for polar bear encounters emphasized avoiding direct confrontation while using deterrent measures to discourage aggressive behavior. These measures included making noise, appearing as large as possible, and backing away slowly while maintaining eye contact with the animal. However, the confined space of the platform and the bear's elevated position made most standard deterrence techniques impractical or dangerous. Thomas and Robert faced the nightmare scenario that safety experts had always hoped to avoid: a close encounter with a polar bear in a confined space with limited escape options. The generator enclosure contained emergency supplies that included flares designed for signaling rescue aircraft, and platform manager Rodriguez authorized the use of these devices as potential deterrents if the bear approached the enclosure directly. Flares produced intense light and chemical smells that might discourage the bear from investigating further, though they also carried the risk of startling the animal into aggressive behavior. The decision to use flares represented a calculated risk based on the crew's assessment that passive measures were no longer sufficient to ensure the safety of the trapped workers. Thomas Evans retrieved 2 marine flares from the emergency supply kit, checking their condition and reviewing the instructions for proper use. These flares were designed to burn for approximately 15 minutes while producing brilliant red light and dense chemical smoke that could be seen from miles away under normal conditions. However, their effectiveness as wildlife deterrents was largely theoretical, since most encounters between humans and polar bears occurred in remote locations where such devices were rarely available or practical to use. Robert Greene maintained visual contact with the approaching bear, while Thomas prepared the flares for immediate use. The bear had paused near a storage container approximately 30 feet from the generator enclosure, standing on its hind legs to investigate smells coming from the ventilation system. This behavior provided a temporary respite that allowed the trapped workers to coordinate their response plan and ensure they were prepared for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the polar bear completed its investigation of the storage container and resumed its methodical exploration of the platform's lower deck, moving directly toward the generator enclosure where Thomas and Robert waited with growing dread. The bear's approach was unhurried but purposeful, suggesting that it had detected something of interest in their location, possibly the human scents that had accumulated during their morning's work. Both men understood that they were about to face the most dangerous situation of their careers, with their survival depending on their ability to deter a 1,200-pound predator using equipment that had never been tested for such purposes. The bear reached the generator enclosure at 2:51 in the afternoon, pausing outside the steel door to investigate the human scents that were clearly detectable despite the cold weather and industrial odors that permeated the platform. The animal's behavior shifted subtly as it processed this new information, its movements becoming more focused and alert as it recognized the presence of potential prey. Thomas and Robert could hear the bear's breathing and the scratch of its claws on the metal decking as it circled the enclosure, testing for potential entry points. Platform personnel watched helplessly from the communications center as the confrontation developed, unable to provide direct assistance without putting additional crew members at risk. Platform manager Rodriguez maintained continuous radio contact with Coast Guard authorities, while Dr. Martinez provided real-time assessment of the bear's behavior and recommendations for the trapped workers' response. The entire crew understood that they were witnessing events that would likely determine whether their colleagues survived the next few minutes. Thomas Evans made the decision to deploy the first flare when the polar bear began testing the strength of the generator enclosure's door, using its massive paws to push against the steel barrier while sniffing intensively around the doorframe. The flare ignited with a brilliant burst of red light and acrid chemical smoke that immediately got the bear's attention, causing it to rear back on its hind legs and vocalize with a deep, rumbling sound that could be heard throughout the platform. The bear's reaction suggested surprise rather than fear, and after a brief hesitation, it approached the flare to investigate this new phenomenon. The flare's intense light and chemical smoke created a temporary barrier between the bear and the generator enclosure, buying precious time for Thomas and Robert to assess their situation and prepare for the next phase of the encounter. However, the bear's investigation of the flare revealed that it was not particularly intimidated by the device, sniffing carefully around the burning chemical and even attempting to manipulate it with its paws. This behavior confirmed Dr. Martinez's warning that polar bears were highly intelligent and adaptable animals that quickly learned to evaluate new threats and determine whether they posed genuine danger. Robert Greene activated his emergency radio beacon while Thomas prepared the second flare for deployment, understanding that their situation was likely to deteriorate rapidly once the bear lost interest in the first flare. The emergency beacon transmitted their exact location and medical status to rescue authorities, though both men understood that help was at least an hour away, even under ideal conditions. Their survival would depend entirely on their ability to deter the bear using the limited resources available in the generator enclosure. The first flare burned for approximately 12 minutes before beginning to fade, during which time the polar bear maintained its investigation of the immediate area while showing no inclination to leave the platform. The bear's behavior suggested that it had established the generator enclosure and its human occupants as objects of particular interest, possibly due to the combination of scents, sounds, and activity that distinguished this area from the rest of the platform. As the flare's intensity diminished, the bear resumed its systematic exploration of the enclosure's perimeter, testing various surfaces and searching for weaknesses that might allow access to the interior. Thomas deployed the second flare when the bear began using its claws to test the metal framework around the enclosure's ventilation system, creating sparks and metallic scraping sounds that indicated the animal's tremendous strength and determination. The second flare produced the same brilliant light and chemical smoke as the first, again causing the bear to rear back and vocalize. But this time the animal's reaction was noticeably less pronounced. The bear had learned from its investigation of the first flare that the devices were not particularly dangerous, reducing their effectiveness as deterrents. At 3:15 in the afternoon, both flares had been deployed and were beginning to fade, leaving Thomas and Robert with no remaining deterrent devices and a polar bear that had become increasingly focused on accessing the generator enclosure. The bear had spent more than 20 minutes investigating the immediate area and had apparently decided that whatever was inside the enclosure was worth the effort required to gain access. Its behavior became more aggressive as it began using its full strength to test the enclosure's structural integrity. The generator enclosure had been designed to withstand Arctic weather conditions rather than attacks by large predators, and the bear's systematic testing revealed several potential weak points in the structure. The ventilation system, electrical conduits, and door frame all showed signs of damage as the bear applied increasing force to its investigation. Thomas and Robert could hear metal beginning to bend and crack under the animal's assault, indicating that their shelter would not provide protection for much longer. Platform manager Rodriguez faced the agonizing decision of whether to authorize more aggressive deterrent measures that might save the trapped workers, but could also result in injury to the polar bear, a federally protected species. Wildlife protection laws carried severe penalties for harming polar bears, even in self-defense situations, but the immediate threat to human life was taking precedence over regulatory concerns. Rodriguez authorized the use of whatever measures were necessary to protect the crew, while instructing communications personnel to document the circumstances that justified their actions. The platform's emergency equipment included several devices that could potentially be used to deter the polar bear, including fire suppression systems, emergency flares, and power tools that could generate loud noises and bright lights. However, most of these devices were located in areas that would require crew members to expose themselves to danger in order to access them. The only immediately available option was the platform's public address system, which could be used to broadcast loud noises and human voices that might discourage the bear's continued assault on the generator enclosure. Communications officer Kevin Walsh began broadcasting a continuous stream of loud industrial noises, human voices, and marine distress signals through the platform's external speakers, creating a cacophony that could be heard for miles across the Arctic landscape. The noise had some effect on the polar bear's behavior, causing it to pause its assault on the generator enclosure and look around for the source of the sounds. However, the bear quickly resumed its efforts to gain access to the enclosure, apparently deciding that the noise did not represent a genuine threat to its safety. At 3:25 in the afternoon, the polar bear succeeded in creating a small opening in the generator enclosure's ventilation system, allowing it to insert its massive paw and begin enlarging the breach. This development marked a critical escalation in the confrontation, since the bear had demonstrated its ability to overcome the enclosure's defenses and would likely gain access to the interior within minutes. Thomas and Robert prepared for direct confrontation with the animal, understanding that their survival now depended on their ability to fight off a 1,200-pound predator using improvised weapons and bare hands. The generator enclosure contained various tools and equipment that could potentially be used as weapons, including heavy wrenches, electrical cables, and maintenance supplies. However, both men understood that conventional weapons would be largely ineffective against an animal of the polar bear's size and strength. Their best hope lay in making themselves appear too dangerous or troublesome to be worth the bear's continued effort, possibly by using noise, movement, and aggressive behavior to convince the animal to seek easier prey elsewhere. Thomas Evans positioned himself near the enlarging breach in the ventilation system, armed with the largest wrench available and prepared to strike at the bear's paw if it attempted to reach through the opening. Robert Greene gathered additional tools and prepared to assist Thomas while maintaining radio contact with the platform's control room. Both men understood that they were facing a situation that few humans had ever survived, but their years of experience working in dangerous conditions had prepared them psychologically for the life-or-death struggle that was about to unfold. The polar bear's assault on the ventilation system continued with methodical persistence, using its powerful claws to tear away metal sheeting and create an opening large enough to allow access to the enclosure's interior. The animal's behavior suggested complete focus on its goal, with no indication that it was considering retreat or alternative objectives. The bear had apparently decided that the humans inside the enclosure represented either a threat to be eliminated or prey to be captured, and it was prepared to use whatever force was necessary to achieve its objective. At 3:32 in the afternoon, the polar bear succeeded in creating an opening large enough to thrust its massive head through the breach, bringing it face to face with Thomas Evans at a distance of less than 3 feet. The confrontation represented the moment that both men had been dreading, forcing them to confront one of nature's most powerful predators under conditions that offered little hope for survival. Thomas struck at the bear's head with his wrench, while Robert attempted to distract the animal by making noise and throwing tools at its body. The bear's reaction to the physical assault was immediate and violent, roaring with a sound that could be heard throughout the platform, while attempting to force its way completely through the opening. The animal's rage was terrifying to witness, transforming it from a curious investigator into a focused killing machine that would not be deterred by any obstacle. Thomas's wrench had little effect on the bear's thick skull and dense fur, serving mainly to increase the animal's determination to reach the humans who had dared to challenge it. Robert Greene attempted to use an electrical cable as a whip to keep the bear at a distance, while Thomas continued his assault with the wrench, but both men quickly realized that their improvised weapons were inadequate for the task they faced. The polar bear's head and shoulders were now through the breach, with its powerful front paws beginning to tear away additional metal sheeting to allow its massive body to follow. The animal's eyes showed no fear or uncertainty, only the focused intensity of a predator that had identified its prey and would not be denied. Platform personnel watched in horror from the communications center as the life-or-death struggle unfolded, unable to provide any meaningful assistance without putting additional crew members at risk. Platform manager Rodriguez maintained continuous contact with emergency authorities while the crew prepared for the worst-case scenario of losing 2 experienced workers to a polar bear attack. The unprecedented nature of the situation meant that established protocols provided little guidance for responding to the crisis. At 3:36 in the afternoon, the polar bear succeeded in forcing its way completely through the breach in the generator enclosure, bringing its full strength and size to bear against the 2 trapped workers. Thomas Evans attempted to retreat to the far corner of the enclosure while continuing to strike at the bear with his wrench, but the confined space offered little room for maneuver. Robert Greene tried to position himself behind the bear to attack from the rear, but the animal's speed and agility made this extremely dangerous. The enclosed space of the generator enclosure became a nightmare arena where 2 humans fought desperately for their lives against a predator that possessed every possible advantage. The polar bear's size allowed it to dominate the entire space, while its strength made the men's improvised weapons largely ineffective. The animal's thick fur and dense muscle provided protection against their attacks, while its powerful jaws and claws could inflict fatal injuries with a single strike. Thomas Evans managed to strike the bear several times with his wrench, targeting the animal's head and shoulders in hopes of causing enough pain to discourage its attack. However, the bear's response to these strikes was increased aggression rather than retreat, and the animal quickly focused its attention on eliminating what it perceived as the primary threat. The bear's powerful jaws clamped down on Thomas's left arm, crushing bone and tearing through multiple layers of protective clothing with ease. Robert Greene attempted to rescue his colleague by attacking the bear from behind, using electrical cables and metal tools to strike at the animal's back and sides. However, the polar bear's attention remained focused on Thomas, and its powerful neck and shoulder muscles allowed it to maintain its grip while shaking its head violently to inflict maximum damage. The sound of breaking bones could be heard clearly by platform personnel monitoring the situation through radio communications. The attack continued for approximately 4 minutes, during which time the polar bear systematically mauled both workers, while they struggled desperately to defend themselves using whatever weapons and tools were available in the confined space. Thomas Evans suffered multiple crushing injuries to his arms and torso as the bear's powerful jaws and claws tore through his protective clothing and inflicted devastating damage to his body. Robert Greene managed to avoid the bear's initial focus, but was ultimately caught when he attempted to help his colleague. The polar bear's assault was characterized by the methodical efficiency of an apex predator that had evolved over thousands of years to kill large prey animals. The bear used its tremendous weight and strength to pin its victims, while its powerful jaws delivered crushing bites that would have been immediately fatal to smaller animals. The men's attempts to fight back served mainly to prolong their suffering rather than providing any realistic hope for survival. At 3:40 in the afternoon, platform manager Rodriguez made the decision to sound the platform's general alarm, alerting all personnel to the life-threatening emergency that was unfolding in the generator enclosure. The alarm activated emergency lighting throughout the platform while automatically transmitting distress signals to Coast Guard authorities and emergency medical services. However, both Thomas Evans and Robert Greene had already sustained injuries that were likely to prove fatal even if immediate medical attention were available. The general alarm also triggered automatic activation of the platform's emergency evacuation procedures, though the presence of a polar bear on the lower deck made evacuation extremely dangerous for other crew members. Platform personnel were ordered to secure themselves in the upper levels of the installation, while emergency authorities attempted to coordinate a rescue operation under deteriorating weather conditions. The platform's isolation and the bear's continued presence made any immediate rescue attempt extremely difficult and dangerous. Communications Officer Kevin Walsh maintained continuous contact with Coast Guard Sector Anchorage while providing real-time updates on the situation aboard the platform. The Coast Guard advised that helicopter operations were impossible due to weather conditions, but they were deploying surface vessels that might be able to reach the platform within several hours if ice conditions permitted. However, both men understood that any rescue effort would likely arrive too late to save the workers who were currently under attack. Dr. Rachel Martinez continued to monitor the polar bear's behavior through surveillance cameras while providing expert analysis of the situation for emergency authorities. Her assessment indicated that the bear was displaying typical predatory behavior patterns and would likely remain on the platform until it had completely consumed its prey or was driven away by external forces. The bear's size and strength made it virtually impossible to deter using any equipment available on the platform. The attack in the generator enclosure continued for nearly 9 minutes total, during which time both Thomas Evans and Robert Green fought courageously but hopelessly against an opponent that possessed overwhelming advantages in size, strength, and natural weaponry. The confined space that had initially provided some protection became a death trap that allowed the bear to focus its full attention on its victims without concern for escape routes or external threats. Thomas Evans sustained the most severe injuries during the initial phase of the attack, suffering multiple crushing wounds to his arms, chest, and head as the polar bear's powerful jaws and claws tore through his protective equipment and inflicted massive trauma to his body. His attempts to defend himself with improvised weapons proved largely ineffective against an animal that had evolved to kill prey much larger and stronger than humans. The bear's methodical assault continued despite Thomas's desperate resistance. Robert Green's injuries were initially less severe as he managed to avoid the bear's primary focus while attempting to rescue his colleague. However, his efforts to help Thomas ultimately brought him within reach of the polar bear's claws and jaws, resulting in devastating injuries that would prove fatal within minutes. The bear's attack on Robert was characterized by the same methodical efficiency that had characterized its assault on Thomas. At 3:41 in the afternoon, communications from the generator enclosure ceased entirely, indicating that both workers had either been killed or rendered unconscious by their injuries. Platform personnel continued to monitor the situation through surveillance cameras, but the view into the generator enclosure was partially obscured by structural damage caused by the bear's assault. The silence from the enclosure created a terrible uncertainty about the fate of the two workers, though their chances for survival were clearly minimal. Platform manager Rodriguez consulted with emergency authorities about the possibility of attempting a rescue operation using available personnel and equipment, but the consensus was that any such attempt would likely result in additional casualties without providing realistic hope for saving the trapped workers. The polar bear remained in the generator enclosure, apparently feeding on its victims, and would pose an extreme threat to any rescue personnel who attempted to approach the area. The platform's crew faced the agonizing reality that two of their colleagues had been killed by a polar bear, while the rest of the team remained trapped on the installation with the predator still present. The bear's continued presence on the platform made it impossible to access critical areas or perform essential maintenance functions, while deteriorating weather conditions prevented evacuation or the arrival of external assistance. The crew was essentially besieged by a 1,200-pound predator that had demonstrated its willingness and ability to kill humans. Weather conditions continued to deteriorate throughout the afternoon, with wind speeds reaching 50 knots and temperatures dropping below -35 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions created additional stress for crew members who were already dealing with the psychological trauma of witnessing their colleagues' deaths while remaining trapped with a dangerous predator. The combination of extreme weather and wildlife threat created a survival situation that tested the limits of the crew's training and psychological resilience. The polar bear remained in the generator enclosure for more than 2 hours after the attack, during which time platform personnel could occasionally hear sounds that suggested the animal was feeding on its victims. These sounds created additional psychological trauma for crew members who had been friends and colleagues of the deceased workers. The bear's behavior confirmed Dr. Martinez's assessment that it would likely remain on the platform until it had completely consumed its prey or was driven away by external forces. At 5:15 in the afternoon, Coast Guard helicopters from Sector Anchorage attempted to approach the platform despite marginal weather conditions, hoping to assess the situation and possibly evacuate surviving crew members. However, the combination of high winds, blowing snow, and limited visibility made helicopter operations extremely dangerous, and the aircraft were forced to return to base after several unsuccessful attempts to land on the platform's helipad. The failed rescue attempt highlighted the platform's complete isolation and the crew's dependence on their own resources for survival, until weather conditions improved sufficiently to allow external assistance. Platform manager Rodriguez implemented additional security measures, including barricading access routes to the lower deck and establishing watch schedules to monitor the polar bear's movements. However, these measures provided only limited protection against an animal that had already demonstrated its ability to overcome the platform's defenses. The bear's presence on the platform created cascading problems that threatened the safety and survival of the entire crew. Critical maintenance functions could not be performed with the predator controlling access to essential equipment, while the psychological stress of the situation began to affect crew members' ability to perform their duties effectively. The platform's normal routines and safety procedures were disrupted by the need to avoid areas where the bear might be encountered. As evening approached, the polar bear finally left the generator enclosure and resumed its exploration of the platform's lower deck, apparently having consumed what it wanted of its victims. The animal's movements were monitored through surveillance cameras as it systematically investigated other areas of the installation, marking territory and searching for additional food sources. The bear showed no inclination to leave the platform, apparently having decided that the installation offered valuable resources worth defending. Platform personnel used the bear's departure from the generator enclosure to attempt visual confirmation of Thomas Evans and Robert Green's condition, though the results were too disturbing to describe in detail over radio communications. Both men had clearly suffered fatal injuries during the bear's attack, and their remains showed evidence of the massive trauma that polar bears could inflict on human victims. The sight of their colleagues' remains added to the psychological trauma already affecting the surviving crew members. The confirmation of both workers' deaths triggered additional protocols for dealing with fatalities in remote locations, including documentation requirements and procedures for preserving evidence that would be needed for subsequent investigations. However, the continued presence of the polar bear made it impossible to secure the scene or recover the victim's remains until the animal could be removed from the platform. The bear's territorial behavior suggested that it might defend the generator enclosure against any attempt to approach the area. Night operations on the platform were complicated by the bear's presence and the crew's uncertainty about the animal's nocturnal behavior patterns. Polar bears were known to be active during both day and night, particularly when they had established a territory or food source that they considered worth defending. The platform's lighting systems provided good visibility of the bear's location, but they also made crew members visible to the predator if they were forced to work in exposed areas. Dr. Martinez explained that polar bears typically remained near a major food source until it was completely consumed, particularly during the fall season when they were building fat reserves for winter survival. This behavior pattern suggested that the bear might remain on the platform for several days, making it impossible to resume normal operations or evacuate crew members until the animal could be removed by wildlife authorities or driven away through aggressive deterrence measures. The platform's communication systems remained operational despite the crisis, allowing continuous contact with Coast Guard authorities and corporate emergency response teams. However, the remoteness of the installation and harsh weather conditions severely limited the options available for resolving the situation. Wildlife authorities indicated that they could provide expertise and guidance for dealing with the polar bear, but their personnel and specialized equipment were located hundreds of miles from the platform. Platform manager Rodriguez faced difficult decisions about resource allocation and crew safety as the crisis extended into the evening hours. The platform's normal operational schedule was completely disrupted by the need to avoid areas where the bear might be encountered, while essential maintenance functions were postponed indefinitely. The crew's food and water supplies were adequate for several days, but the psychological stress of the situation was already affecting morale and performance. The bear's behavior during the evening hours included continued exploration of the platform's lower deck, with particular attention to areas where food odors might be concentrated. The animal's thorough investigation of waste disposal areas, ventilation systems, and storage compartments suggested that it was evaluating the platform as a long-term food source, rather than simply passing through during its travels. This assessment was particularly troubling since it indicated that the bear might establish the platform as part of its regular territory. Crew members took turns monitoring the bear's movements through surveillance cameras, while maintaining security watches to prevent the animal from accessing upper levels of the platform. The watch schedule was designed to ensure that the bear's location was known at all times, while providing early warning if it attempted to climb to areas occupied by personnel. However, the crew's ability to maintain effective surveillance was limited by the stress and fatigue that accompanied the traumatic events of the day. As midnight approached on December 4th, 2025, the polar bear settled into the generator enclosure area where it had killed Thomas Evans and Robert Green, apparently establishing this location as its primary territory on the platform. The bear's territorial behavior included scent marking and defensive posturing that suggested it was prepared to remain in the area indefinitely. This development created additional challenges for any rescue or deterrence efforts that might be attempted once weather conditions improved. The first 24 hours of the crisis established patterns of behavior and survival strategies that would characterize the crew's experience for the remainder of their ordeal. The polar bear had demonstrated its ability to kill humans and overcome the platform's defensive measures, while the crew had learned that their isolation and the harsh Arctic environment made external assistance extremely difficult to obtain. The death of two experienced workers served as a grim reminder of the stakes involved in their struggle for survival. Platform communications logs documented every aspect of the crisis for subsequent investigation by multiple agencies, including detailed records of the bear's behavior, crew responses, and external assistance efforts. These records would eventually provide crucial evidence for understanding how the tragedy had developed and what measures might prevent similar incidents in the future. However, the immediate focus remained on ensuring the survival of the 18 crew members who remained trapped on the platform with a dangerous predator. The psychological impact of witnessing their colleagues' deaths while remaining trapped with the bear created additional challenges for the surviving crew members. Several workers reported difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and anxiety symptoms that could affect their ability to perform critical safety functions. Platform manager Rodriguez worked with the crew's medical personnel to provide psychological support while maintaining operational readiness for emergency situations. Weather forecasts for December 4th indicated continued deterioration of conditions, with temperatures expected to drop below -40 degrees Fahrenheit and wind speeds potentially exceeding 60 knots. These conditions would make helicopter operations impossible while creating additional stress for crew members who were already dealing with extreme psychological pressure. The platform's heating systems and emergency supplies were adequate for extended operations, but the crew's mental state remained a significant concern. The Bear's presence also created complications for the platform's waste management and sanitation systems, since normal disposal procedures required access to areas now controlled by the Predator. Alternative arrangements were implemented to prevent the accumulation of waste materials that might attract additional wildlife to the platform. However, these modifications to normal procedures created additional workload and stress for crew members who were already operating under extreme conditions. Corporate emergency response teams worked throughout the night to coordinate assistance for the trapped crew, consulting with wildlife authorities, weather services, and specialized rescue organizations. However, the unique combination of extreme weather, dangerous wildlife, and remote location created a situation that exceeded the capabilities of most emergency response systems. The platform's crew would be largely dependent on their own resources until conditions improved sufficiently to allow external intervention. As dawn approached on December 4th, the Polar Bear remained in control of the platform's lower deck, while the surviving crew members continued their vigil from the upper levels of the installation. The animal showed no signs of leaving voluntarily, and its territorial behavior suggested that it had established the platform as a permanent addition to its range. The crew faced the prospect of an extended siege by one of nature's most dangerous predators, with no clear timeline for resolution of the crisis. The deaths of Thomas Evans and Robert Green marked the beginning of what would become one of the most unusual and challenging wildlife emergencies in Arctic industrial history. Their sacrifice highlighted both the dangers of working in polar bear habitat and the limitations of existing safety protocols when dealing with large predators in confined industrial settings. The surviving crew members would carry the memory of their colleagues' courage and the trauma of their deaths for the remainder of their lives, while learning lessons about survival and teamwork that would be passed on to future generations of Arctic workers. The generator enclosure where both men died became a grim monument to the power of Arctic wildlife and the vulnerability of human industrial installations in one of Earth's most hostile environments. The Bear's successful breach of what had been considered secure shelter demonstrated that even well-designed facilities could be overcome by determined predators, forcing a complete re-evaluation of safety protocols for offshore installations in polar bear habitat. Emergency responders who eventually reached the platform would find evidence of the desperate struggle that had taken place in the generator enclosure, including damaged equipment, bloodstains, and the improvised weapons that Thomas and Robert had used in their final battle. The physical evidence would provide crucial information for understanding how the attack had developed and what measures might have prevented the tragedy, though the emotional impact of the scene would remain with investigators for years to come. The 9 minutes of terror that claimed the lives of Thomas Evans and Robert Green represented a convergence of circumstances that Arctic safety experts had long feared but hoped never to encounter. The men's deaths served as a tragic reminder that human technology and determination, while formidable, remained vulnerable to the raw power of nature when conditions aligned against survival. Their story would eventually influence safety protocols, emergency procedures, and wildlife management policies throughout the Arctic industrial sector, ensuring that their sacrifice contributed to the protection of future workers in polar bear territory. The platform's crew spent the remaining hours of darkness maintaining their vigilance, while processing the trauma of losing two colleagues to one of the most violent deaths imaginable. The bears' continued presence served as a constant reminder of their vulnerability and isolation, while the knowledge that similar attacks might occur at any time created ongoing psychological stress that would affect their performance and decision-making abilities. The crew's survival would depend on their ability to function effectively despite these psychological challenges, while avoiding additional confrontations with the predator that had already demonstrated its willingness and ability to kill humans. Weather conditions on December 4th showed slight improvement by mid-morning, with wind speeds dropping to 35 knots and visibility increasing enough to allow limited helicopter operations. Coast Guard rescue crews prepared to attempt another approach to the platform, though the continued presence of the polar bear created significant complications for any evacuation effort. The bear's territorial behavior and proven aggression toward humans made it extremely dangerous for rescue personnel to land on the platform or attempt to approach areas where crew members might be evacuated. Wildlife authorities consulted with polar bear specialists about options for removing the animal from the platform without causing harm to either the bear or the remaining crew members. These discussions revealed the complexity of dealing with large predators in industrial settings, since most deterrence techniques were designed for open terrain rather than confined spaces where escape routes were limited. The bear's size and strength made conventional tranquilizer darts problematic, while its elevated position on the platform created additional challenges for wildlife management personnel. Platform manager Rodriguez worked with his crew to develop contingency plans for various scenarios, including emergency evacuation procedures that might be used if the bear could be temporarily deterred from critical areas of the platform. These plans required careful coordination between platform personnel and external rescue teams, with precise timing to minimize exposure to the predator. However, the bear's unpredictable behavior and proven ability to move quickly made any evacuation attempt extremely risky. The crew's psychological state continued to deteriorate as they entered their second day of siege conditions, with several workers reporting symptoms of acute stress reaction, including insomnia, anxiety, and difficulty concentrating. The platform's medical personnel provided what support they could using available resources, but the ongoing threat and isolation created challenges that exceeded their training and equipment. The crew's ability to function effectively under these conditions would be crucial for their long-term survival and the success of any rescue efforts. Dr. Rachel Martinez continued her detailed observations of the polar bear's behavior, documenting patterns that might provide insights into the animal's intentions and possible responses to deterrence efforts. Her analysis indicated that the bear was displaying classic territorial behavior, including scent marking and defensive posturing, that suggested it intended to remain on the platform indefinitely. This assessment was particularly troubling since it indicated that the crew might face an extended siege that could last for weeks or months. The bear's feeding behavior also provided disturbing evidence of its predatory success, as the animal had clearly consumed significant portions of both victims while establishing food caches that could sustain it for extended periods. This behavior pattern was consistent with polar bears' natural tendency to remain near major food sources until they were completely exhausted, suggesting that the platform might remain occupied by the predator for much longer than initially anticipated. Communication with families of the deceased workers created additional emotional challenges for platform manager Rodriguez and the corporate crisis management team. The remote location and ongoing danger made it impossible to recover the victims' remains or provide the closure that their families desperately needed. These conversations were among the most difficult aspects of the crisis, requiring platform management to balance honesty about the situation with sensitivity to the family's grief and trauma. Media attention to the crisis began building as news of the polar bear attack spread through industry communications channels and emergency service networks. However, the platform's remote location and ongoing danger made it impossible for journalists to access the scene directly, limiting coverage to official statements and speculation based on limited information. The unusual nature of the incident attracted attention from wildlife conservation groups, labor safety organizations, and Arctic industry stakeholders. The bear's presence on the platform also created complications for the installation's environmental compliance obligations, since normal monitoring and reporting procedures required access to areas now controlled by the predator. Alternative arrangements were developed to maintain compliance with federal environmental regulations while ensuring crew safety, though these modifications created additional administrative burden during an already stressful situation. Corporate executives worked with government officials to coordinate resources for resolving the crisis while managing the significant legal and financial implications of the incident. The deaths of 2 workers in a polar bear attack represented an unprecedented situation that fell outside the scope of most insurance policies and emergency response procedures. The company faced potential liability issues while also dealing with the immediate need to protect surviving workers and maintain operations at other facilities. As afternoon approached on December 4th, weather conditions continued to improve gradually, raising hopes that helicopter evacuation might become possible within the next 24 hours. However, the polar bear's continued control of the platform's lower deck and landing areas created significant obstacles for any rescue attempt. The crew prepared for the possibility of emergency evacuation, while understanding that their survival might ultimately depend on their ability to coexist with the predator until it could be safely removed. The platform's emergency supplies were inventoried and rationed to ensure adequate resources for an extended siege, while crew members were assigned to rotating watch schedules that would maintain surveillance of the bear while preventing fatigue-related accidents. These preparations reflected the crew's growing understanding that their ordeal might continue for days or weeks, requiring careful management of both physical and psychological resources to ensure their survival. The generator enclosure where Thomas Evans and Robert Green had died remained under the bear's control, serving as both a feeding site and territorial marker that the animal defended aggressively against any perceived intrusion. The crew's inability to access this area created operational difficulties while also serving as a constant reminder of their colleagues' fate. The psychological impact of this situation continued to affect crew performance and morale as they entered their second night of siege conditions. Emergency response coordination became increasingly complex as multiple agencies attempted to develop solutions for the unprecedented situation. Coast Guard personnel, wildlife authorities, corporate crisis managers, and medical personnel all contributed expertise while struggling to overcome the limitations imposed by weather, distance, and the presence of a large predator. The coordination challenges highlighted gaps in existing emergency response procedures for remote industrial installations in polar bear habitat. The bear's nocturnal behavior patterns became increasingly important as darkness fell on December 4th, since crew members needed to understand when and where the animal might be encountered if emergency evacuation became necessary. Dr. Martinez's observations suggested that the bear was most active during dawn and dusk hours, though it remained alert and potentially dangerous throughout the night. This information would be crucial for planning any rescue operations that might be attempted under cover of darkness. Platform communication systems continued to function effectively despite the crisis, providing continuous contact with emergency authorities and corporate support teams. However, the crew's psychological need for contact with their families created additional challenges for communications personnel who had to balance operational requirements with personal needs during an extremely stressful situation. These conversations provided emotional support while also creating additional stress for family members who could do nothing to help their trapped loved ones. The crew's religious and spiritual needs also required attention as they faced the possibility of extended captivity or additional deaths. Several crew members requested contact with chaplains or spiritual advisors who could provide comfort and guidance during the crisis. These conversations were facilitated through the platform's communication systems, providing psychological support that complemented the medical and operational assistance being provided by other personnel. Food preparation and consumption became more challenging as the crew adapted to siege conditions, with meals served in secure areas and waste disposal modified to prevent attracting additional wildlife to the platform. The platform's cook worked with available supplies to maintain nutrition and morale, while accommodating the restrictions imposed by the bear's presence. These adaptations required creativity and cooperation from all crew members as they adjusted to their new reality. The platform's heating and power systems continued to operate normally despite the crisis, though crew members understood that any equipment failures could create life-threatening emergencies under current conditions. Maintenance personnel worked carefully to ensure continued operation of critical systems while avoiding areas where they might encounter the polar bear. These efforts required extensive coordination and planning to minimize risk while maintaining the platform's habitability. As December 5th approached, the crew faced their third day of captivity with growing awareness that their ordeal might continue for an extended period. The polar bear showed no signs of leaving voluntarily, while weather conditions remained too harsh for helicopter operations or other rescue attempts. The crew's survival would continue to depend on their ability to maintain psychological resilience while avoiding additional confrontations with the predator that had already claimed 2 lives. The deaths of Thomas Evans and Robert Green had created a permanent change in the crew's understanding of their vulnerability and the dangers they faced in their remote Arctic workplace. Their sacrifice served as a grim reminder of the price that could be paid for working in polar bear territory, while their courage during the final confrontation provided an example of determination and loyalty that inspired their surviving colleagues. The memory of their struggle would remain with the crew long after the immediate crisis had passed, influencing their approach to safety and teamwork for the remainder of their careers. The platform's experience also highlighted the need for improved safety protocols, emergency equipment, and wildlife management procedures at Arctic industrial installations. The lessons learned from Thomas and Robert's deaths would eventually influence industry standards and regulatory requirements, ensuring that their sacrifice contributed to the protection of future workers in polar bear habitat. However, the immediate focus remained on ensuring the survival of their colleagues, who continued to face the same predator that had claimed their lives. The generator enclosure, where both men had died, became a focal point for the bear's territorial behavior, with the animal returning repeatedly to the site where it had achieved its predatory success. This behavior pattern created additional challenges for any attempts to recover the victim's remains or restore normal operations in that area of the platform. The bear's attachment to the site suggested that it might remain on the platform indefinitely unless actively driven away by external forces. Weather forecasts for the coming days indicated continued harsh conditions that would prevent helicopter operations while creating additional stress for the trapped crew members. The combination of extreme cold, high winds, and limited visibility would test the platform's systems and the crew's endurance while making any rescue attempts extremely dangerous. The crew prepared for the possibility of spending a week or more under siege conditions while hoping for improvement in weather that would allow external assistance. The polar bear's successful attack on Thomas Evans and Robert Greene had established a precedent that would influence wildlife behavior throughout the Arctic region, as other bears learned that offshore platforms could provide both food sources and territorial advantages. This development created long-term implications for Arctic industrial operations, requiring new approaches to wildlife management and facility design that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. The immediate crisis would eventually end, but its impact on Arctic operations would continue for years to come. The crew's experience during those first critical days of December 2024 would become a defining moment in Arctic industrial safety, demonstrating both the courage of workers like Thomas Evans and Robert Greene and the limitations of existing safety protocols when confronted with the raw power of Arctic wildlife. Their story served as a bridge between the industrial ambitions of human civilization and the ancient territorial imperatives of polar bears, creating a tragedy that would influence policy and practice throughout the circumpolar Arctic for generations to come. As rescue operations finally began to show promise on December 6th, with improved weather allowing helicopter approaches to the platform, the crew understood that their survival had been purchased with the lives of two colleagues who had faced impossible odds with courage and determination. Thomas Evans and Robert Greene had died defending their workplace and their fellow crew members against one of nature's most formidable predators, earning a place in the pantheon of Arctic heroes whose sacrifice advanced human understanding of survival in Earth's most challenging environment. The 9 minutes of terror that had claimed their lives would be remembered as a watershed moment in Arctic industrial safety, when the theoretical possibility of polar bear encounters became a deadly reality that forever changed how humans approach work and survival in the domain of the ice bear. Their deaths marked not an end, but a beginning of new awareness and preparation that would honor their memory while protecting future workers who would follow in their footsteps across the frozen seas of the Arctic Ocean.